I am Maya, 35 years old, and building a branding agency from the ground up was easy compared to raising my sister's abandoned children. 14 years ago, my sister Chloe dropped her two toddlers on my porch, claiming she needed exactly 2 hours to get her nails done. She never came back. At least not until she showed up with a lawyer, and the police accusing me of kidnapping the very children she threw away. When the time came, I handed the judge a single manila envelope. He looked inside, froze completely, and asked me, "Do they know?" I simply replied, "Not yet." Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to protect the ones you love from the toxic family you share DNA with. Tonight was supposed to be a flawless celebration. We were dining at an upscale steakhouse in downtown Atlanta, the kind of prestigious establishment with low ambient lighting, dark mahogany tables, and waiters wearing crisp white aprons. The scent of roasted garlic and seared ribeye filled the air. I raised my glass of sparkling cider to toast my nephew Malik. He was turning 18, a massive milestone I had been dreaming of since he was a crying 4-year-old, holding my hand on my cramped apartment floor. Sitting next to him was my niece Aaliyah, now 16, and rolling her eyes affectionately at her brother's terrible jokes. They were my entire world. I had been just 21 when they were left with me, a broke college student, desperately trying to figure out how to survive. Now I owned a highly successful branding agency, and we were finally comfortable, safe, and happy. We were laughing about Malik's upcoming college applications, discussing whether he should stay in state or venture out to the coast. Aaliyah was teasing him about how much she would take over his bedroom the second he left for the dorms. It was a perfect evening, a testament to the family we had built together through sheer willpower and unconditional love. But then the heavy wooden double doors of the restaurant swung open with such force that several people at nearby tables turned their heads in alarm. Waiters carrying silver trays froze in their tracks. The cold draft from the street cut through the warm restaurant air. I looked up toward the entrance, and the proud smile completely froze on my face. Striding through the elegant dining room, dodging waitstaff and aggressively pushing past tables, was a woman I had not laid eyes on in 14 long years. Chloe. My older sister looked absolutely nothing like the frantic, disheveled 23-year-old who had run away from her responsibilities all those years ago. She was dripping in high-end designer labels, wearing a pristine white tailored pantsuit, a diamond tennis bracelet catching the light from the chandeliers, and carrying a luxury handbag that likely cost more than my first car. But she was not walking alone. Striding right beside her with an unbearable self-satisfied smirk on his face was a wealthy-looking white man in a custom navy suit. I would later learn this was Trent, her new husband. Flanking them were two fully uniformed Atlanta police officers, their hands resting near their duty belts, and a stern-looking man clutching a thick leather briefcase. The lively hum of the restaurant ground to an absolute halt. The clinking of fine silverware and the soft background jazz music seemed to vanish entirely as Chloe marched straight toward our booth. Malik and Aaliyah stopped laughing immediately. They stared at the approaching group in total confusion. They did not recognize the woman standing over us. Why would they? She was a complete stranger to them, a ghost from a past they barely remembered. Chloe did not say hello. She did not ask how her children were doing after over a decade of absolute silence. She did not even look at their faces with anything resembling maternal love. Instead, she pointed a perfectly manicured finger directly at my face and screamed at the top of her lungs. "Officers, that is her. That is the woman who kidnapped my babies." The words echoed off the high restaurant ceilings. For a second, my brain could not even process the sheer absurdity of the statement. Kidnapped. Diners at the surrounding tables gasped audibly. I saw at least half a dozen people immediately pull out their smartphones to record the unfolding drama. The public humiliation was swift and suffocating as the entire restaurant watched us like a reality television spectacle. Aaliyah let out a small, terrified sound and instinctively slid her chair closer to mine, grabbing the back of my blazer with trembling hands. Her eyes were wide with panic, darting between the police officers, and the strange woman demanding to take her away. She buried her face into my shoulder, hiding from the dozens of cell phone lenses pointed in our direction. Malik stood up instantly, his teenage frame suddenly tense and fiercely protective, trying to put himself between me and the police officers who were now stepping up to our table. "Mom," one of the officers said, his voice stern and commanding, "we are going to need you to step outside and answer some questions right now." I did not panic. I could feel my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird, but I forced my breathing to slow down. I had spent 14 years protecting these kids from every scrape, bruise, and heartbreak life threw at them. I was not about to let the woman who abandoned them terrorize them on Malik's 18th birthday. I stood up slowly, deliberately, placing myself in front of Malik and Aaliyah, blocking Chloe's view of them entirely. "I am not going anywhere," I said, my voice steady and carrying just enough volume to be heard clearly over the whispers of the crowd. "And you are certainly not traumatizing my children." Chloe let out a theatrical fake sob, clinging to Trent's arm like a fragile victim. "Your children!" she wailed loudly enough for the cameras. "You stole them from me. You manipulated them and hid them away from their real mother." Trent patted her hand patronizingly before stepping forward. His smug superiority radiated from him in waves. He looked at me like I was a pest he had found on his shoe. "That is enough of the charade, Maya," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "You have played house long enough. It is time to return my wife's property." Property! The word made my blood boil with such intense rage I could barely see straight. Before I could tear into him, the man with the briefcase stepped forward. He did not introduce himself. He simply opened the leather flap, pulled out a thick stack of heavy legal documents, and slapped them right down onto my dinner plate, splashing expensive steak sauce onto the pristine white paper. "You have been served," the lawyer said coldly, loud enough for the police to hear. "We are filing federal kidnapping charges and an emergency injunction for immediate full custody of the minors. You will also be facing a civil suit for alienation of affection aimed at liquidating your entire business assets to pay for the emotional distress you have caused my clients." I looked down at the sauce-stained legal documents resting on my plate, then looked up at the lawyer without blinking. I did not raise my voice, but I made sure every word dripped with absolute authority. "There will be no federal kidnapping charges," I stated firmly, turning my attention directly to the two police officers who were watching the exchange closely. "Officers, my name is Maya, and I am the legal guardian of these two teenagers. I have had full physical custody for 14 years, ever since this woman dropped them on my apartment porch to go get a manicure and never returned. I have the notarized guardianship paperwork signed by her own hand in a safe at my home." The officers exchanged a hesitant look, their aggressive posture softening slightly as they realized they might have been dragged into a messy civil dispute rather than an active criminal kidnapping. "Ma'am, we still need to verify your claims," the older officer said, but his tone was noticeably more respectful. "We received a frantic call from the mother stating you had fled across state lines years ago." I let out a sharp, humorless laugh that echoed in the silent dining room. Fled across state lines. I have lived in the exact same city, running a highly visible branding agency under my own legal name for over a decade. Does this look like the behavior of a fugitive hiding from the law? I gestured to the lavish table, the remnants of our expensive dinner, and the obvious comfort of our lives. Trent sneered, his face flushing red as the narrative began to slip from his grasp. "Do not listen to her lies, officer. She is a master manipulator. My wife has been searching for her children for years." Malik, who had been standing silently behind me, finally spoke up, his voice cracking slightly, but filled with raw anger. "She is not my mother. Maya is my mother. I do not even know who this lady is, and I want her away from my family." The collective gasp from the restaurant patrons was audible. Chloe clutched her chest dramatically, pretending to be wounded by the rejection of a son she had willfully discarded. The lawyer quickly gathered the stained documents from my plate, shoving them aggressively into my hands. "The paperwork is filed regardless of what you tell the police," he hissed, stepping back. "Enjoy your birthday dinner because it will be the last peaceful meal you ever have. We are taking the kids back, and we are taking every dime your little agency has ever made, down to the very last cent." I stood tall, holding the filthy documents as they finally turned around and marched out of the restaurant, leaving a stunned silence in their wake. The battle had officially begun. Before the heavy wooden doors of the restaurant could fully swing shut behind them, the older police officer stepped sharply into their path. He raised a heavy hand, halting Trent and his lawyer in their tracks. The dining room was completely silent, save for the soft hum of the air conditioning and the shifting of patrons desperate to catch every word. The officer turned his attention back to our table, his hand resting calmly on his radio. He looked at me, then looked at Chloe, who was still clinging to Trent's expensive suit jacket. "You cannot just make an accusation of federal kidnapping and then march out the door to let us clean up your mess," the officer said, his voice carrying a no-nonsense authority. "If you are claiming these minors were abducted, we need to verify the facts right here and right now. Otherwise, you are filing a false police report, and that is a crime in itself." Chloe spun around, her white designer pantsuit swishing as she glared at the officer. Her face was flushed with a mixture of indignation and panic. "Are you blind?" she shrieked, pointing a manicured finger back at me. "She is keeping my babies hostage. I am their biological mother. Arrest her right now and put my children in my car." I did not wait for the officer to respond. I stepped out from behind the table, pulling my shoulders back and squaring my stance. The mother bear instinct that had kept my family afloat for 14 years roared to life in my chest. I was not going to let this woman rewrite history in front of my children. "You want to talk about being a mother?" I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous icy register that easily carried across the silent restaurant. "Let us talk about it, Chloe. Let us talk about the history you are so desperately trying to hide from your wealthy new husband and his lawyer." Trent scoffed, crossing his arms over his chest. "Do not listen to her lies. She is a master manipulator." I ignored him, keeping my eyes locked dead on my sister. I took a slow, deliberate step forward. "It was a Tuesday in November," I said, clearly painting the picture for everyone in the room. Freezing rain was rattling the single-pane windows of my tiny studio apartment on the south side. I was 21 years old, studying for my college midterms on a mattress on the floor because I could not afford a bed frame. Chloe visibly flinched. She looked up at Trent, attempting to pull him toward the door, but the police officer stood firmly in the way. "You brought Malik, who was 4 years old, and Aaliyah, who was barely 2. I continued, refusing to let her escape the truth. Aaliyah had a terrible chest cold. Her breathing was ragged and her nose was running. You were wearing a cheap faux leather jacket smelling like acrylic nail liquid and bad decisions. You dropped a plastic grocery bag containing 3 soiled onesies and a half-empty box of stale cereal onto my floor. The patrons at the surrounding tables were hanging on my every word. Some had lowered their phones, completely captivated by the raw reality of the confrontation. Aaliyah was gripping my hand so tightly, her knuckles were turning white. I squeezed back, letting her know she was safe. "You looked me dead in the eye, Chloe," I said, raising my voice just enough to ensure the police officers heard every single syllable. "You looked at your sick toddler and your hungry 4-year-old son, and you told me you needed just 2 hours to get your nails done for a job interview. 2 hours. You walked out that door, got into a silver sedan with a man whose last name you did not even know, and you drove out of the state of Georgia." Silence hung heavily in the room. Chloe was staring at the floor, her face pale, her jaw clenched tight. "I waited 2 hours," I said, my voice trembling slightly with the ghost of that old panic, before turning to pure steel. "Then I waited 2 days, then 2 weeks. You changed your phone number. You abandoned your own flesh and blood to go party across the country, leaving a broke 21-year-old college student to figure out how to buy asthma medication and toddler formula. I worked 3 jobs. I skipped meals so they could eat. I built an entire business from the ground up so they would never have to feel the sting of poverty or abandonment again." Trent's lawyer stepped forward, attempting to salvage their crumbling narrative. He adjusted his glasses and looked at me with a sneer. "This is nothing but irrelevant hearsay to distract the authorities. The fact remains that you have no legal biological claim to these minors. We have filed federal kidnapping charges and we are pursuing a massive civil suit for alienation of affection. You deliberately poisoned their minds against their mother. Before I could tear into the lawyer, the crowd of onlookers near the restaurant entrance suddenly parted. A woman stepped through the gap, her heels clicking sharply against the hardwood floor. She was dressed impeccably, wearing a tailored burgundy dress and smelling of heavy, expensive floral perfume. My heart skipped a beat. For one brief, foolish second, the little girl inside me thought my mother had arrived to defend me. I thought Cynthia had seen the commotion from the street and marched in to protect her grandchildren from the woman who threw them away. But Cynthia did not walk toward me. She walked directly over to Chloe and Trent, placing a supportive hand on Chloe's shoulder. She turned her head and glared at me with absolute, unadulterated disdain. The betrayal hit me with the force of a physical blow. I had not seen my mother in 5 years. She never called Malik on his birthdays. She never sent Aaliyah a Christmas card. She had openly criticized me for taking the kids in, calling me a fool for ruining my 20s to raise someone else's burdens. Yet here she was, standing shoulder to shoulder with the millionaire stranger who wanted to destroy my life. "Just give her back her kids, Maya," Cynthia said, her voice echoing with a cold, elitist superiority that made my stomach turn. I stared at the woman who gave birth to me, completely disgusted. My own mother. The woman who watched me struggle to buy groceries, who never offered a single dime to help raise her own grandchildren. Now she was standing with Trent, looking at me like I was the hired help who had overstayed her welcome. She was siding with wealth and status over loyalty and truth. "Do not talk to my mother like that!" Malik suddenly shouted, his deep voice startling everyone. He stepped completely in front of me, shielding me from Cynthia and Chloe. "You are not my family. Maya is my mother. She is the only mother I have ever had, and I am not going anywhere with strangers." Cynthia scoffed, waving a dismissive hand at Malik. "Oh, please, Malik, do not be dramatic. Your mother has finally settled down and Trent can offer you a proper life, a 2-parent home, a future you could never have with Maya." I placed a hand on Malik's shoulder, gently moving him back slightly. I looked directly into the older police officer's eyes. "Officer, I have a secure digital vault on my phone for emergencies exactly like this one. I have the notarized guardianship document signed by Chloe and witnessed by Cynthia herself 14 years ago." I pulled my smartphone from my purse, my hands completely steady. I unlocked the screen and opened the encrypted application, finding the PDF scan I had guarded with my life for over a decade. I handed the phone to the officer. "I tracked her down 14 years ago, just long enough to force her into a notary office, so I could legally enroll Malik in kindergarten," I explained while the officer read the screen. "She signed over full physical and legal guardianship. She relinquished her daily rights because she did not want the responsibility." The tension in the restaurant was thick enough to cut with a knife. Trent was pacing aggressively, checking his expensive watch. The lawyer looked incredibly smug, until the police officer slowly lowered the phone and handed it back to me. The officer turned to Trent and Chloe, shaking his head firmly. "This document clearly grants Maya full physical and legal guardianship," the officer announced, projecting his voice so the entire room could hear the final verdict. "There is no kidnapping here. This is a civil matter regarding custody, and it needs to be handled in a family court. There will be absolutely no arrests made tonight." Trent turned a deep shade of crimson. He pointed a finger at the police officer, his entitlement boiling over. "You have no idea who you are dealing with. I will have your badge for this. I will call the commissioner directly." The officer simply crossed his arms, unbothered by the threat. "You can call whoever you like, sir. But if you do not step out of this restaurant right now, I will arrest you for disturbing the peace and threatening a police officer." Trent gritted his teeth, grabbing Chloe's arm and dragging her toward the door. Cynthia followed closely behind them, casting one last venomous glare in my direction. But the lawyer lingered for a moment, turning back to face me with a chilling, predatory smile. He pointed his briefcase directly at me. "Enjoy your weekend, Maya," he hissed, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "Because on Monday morning, your business accounts will be completely frozen. Your personal accounts will be locked. You will not have a single dime to fight us in court. We are taking the children, and we are taking your agency. You are going to lose absolutely everything." He spun on his heel and marched out the doors, finally leaving us in peace. The restaurant manager quickly rushed over to our table, apologizing profusely for the disruption and offering to comp our entire meal. I politely declined his offer, paying the bill in full and adding a massive tip for our poor waiter who had been caught in the crossfire. I gathered Malik and Aaliyah, pulling them into a fierce protective embrace right there in the middle of the dining room. They were shaking, but they were safe. We walked out of the steakhouse with our heads held high, presenting a united, unbreakable front to the staring patrons. Our birthday dinner was completely ruined, but as we stepped out into the warm Atlanta night air, my resolve had never been stronger. The legal war had officially been declared, and I was preparing to burn their entire world to the ground. The very next afternoon, the reality of their threat breached the one place I considered impenetrable. I was sitting at my glass desk at the branding agency reviewing a marketing campaign for a new client when my cell phone buzzed with an alert from my basic doorbell camera app. I swiped the screen and my blood instantly ran cold. The live video feed showed my mother, Cynthia, standing on my front porch. She was twisting a silver key into my deadbolt. It was the emergency spare key I had given her 7 years ago when I had an emergency appendectomy and needed someone to feed my dog. I had completely forgotten she even possessed it because she had never once used it to visit her grandchildren. I watched in absolute horror as the heavy front door swung open. Cynthia stepped inside, and right behind her walked Chloe and Trent carrying empty designer luggage. I dropped my presentation folders right onto the floor, grabbed my car keys, and sprinted to the parking garage. I broke every single speed limit driving back to my neighborhood. My mind raced with dark, terrifying scenarios. I knew Malik and Aaliyah were still in their afternoon classes at high school, but the sanctity of our home, our safe haven, was being violently invaded. I slammed my car into the driveway, leaving the driver's side door wide open as my tires screeched against the concrete. I stormed up the porch steps and pushed through the front door. The heavy scent of Cynthia's expensive floral perfume hung in the foyer. The sound of casual rummaging and light laughter echoed from the second floor. I took the wooden stairs 2 at a time, my pulse hammering in my ears. I marched straight into Aaliyah's bedroom, and the sight before me made me see red. Chloe was standing in front of my niece's closet, carelessly pulling brightly colored sundresses and denim jackets off the hangers. She was tossing them into a massive leather Louis Vuitton suitcase, resting right on Aaliyah's pristine white comforter. Trent was leaning against the bedroom doorframe, inspecting the neighborhood through the window with a look of utter boredom. Cynthia was sitting at the edge of the bed, neatly folding a pile of sweaters. "Drop it!" I commanded, my voice shaking the walls of the bedroom. "I demand to know what you think you are doing in my house." Chloe barely flinched. She turned around, offering me that irritating glossy smile that had gotten her out of trouble her entire life. She ran a hand through her perfectly blown-out hair. "Relax, Maya," she said casually. "We are just collecting my children's belongings. Trent is having their new bedrooms at the estate painted this week, so they will be moving in by Saturday." I did not negotiate. I did not debate. I stepped forward, grabbed the heavy designer suitcase by its leather handle, and violently dumped its entire contents onto the floor. Clothes spilled everywhere. I kicked the empty suitcase toward Trent's expensive leather shoes and pointed directly at the hallway. "Get out of my house immediately," I ordered, my voice dropping to a lethal octave. Trent puffed out his chest, trying to use his height and physical size to intimidate me. He stepped away from the window, crossing his arms. "Now listen here, Maya." He started, his tone dripping with wealthy white male privilege. "We have legal filings in motion. You cannot keep a mother from her children." I cut him off, stepping directly into his personal space. "I am running on pure adrenaline, and I do not care how much money is sitting in your bank account, Trent. If you do not step out of this hallway right now, I will press the panic button on my alarm system and have you arrested for breaking and entering." Cynthia quickly stood up from the bed, holding her hands out in a placating gesture. "Maya, stop acting crazy," she scolded, treating me exactly like the scapegoat I had always been. "We are doing this the easy way, so you do not have to pack their things later. I pointed to the stairs and screamed for them to get out. My fierce reaction finally broke through their arrogant facade. Trent grabbed Chloe's arm and muttered that they should wait for the lawyers to handle me. They retreated down the stairs and out the front door, but the confrontation did not end there. It exploded right onto my front lawn. The afternoon sun was beating down on us. I could see the blinds twitching in the windows of my neighbors' houses, but I did not care who was watching. As I stood on my porch, ensuring they were walking toward Trent's luxury SUV, the real psychological warfare began. Cynthia turned on her heel and marched back to the bottom of my porch steps, glaring at me with venomous eyes. "You are a bitter, jealous woman, Maya," Cynthia yelled, pointing her finger at my chest. "You should be on your knees thanking your sister, thanking her." I let out a harsh laugh, thanking her for what, Cynthia? For abandoning 2 toddlers for a manicure. Cynthia shook her head aggressively, refusing to hear the truth. She was just a young girl who made a mistake. Cynthia justified, her voice dripping with endless empathy for the golden child. Chloe was overwhelmed. She needed time to find herself. She had to go on a journey to become the woman she is today. A journey, I repeated, my voice cracking with 14 years of suppressed exhaustion. Cynthia gestured proudly toward Trent, who was standing by his vehicle looking deeply annoyed by the suburban drama. "Trent is a successful, respectable man," Cynthia declared. "He can finally give Malik and Aaliyah a proper 2-parent home. A real family, Maya. Look at this cute little starter house you have here. It is nothing compared to what Trent can offer them. They deserve a father. They deserve a mother who does not have to work herself to the bone just to keep the lights on." The audacity of her words took my breath away. She was weaponizing traditional family values to shame a successful single guardian. She was taking my 14 years of relentless sacrifice and diminishing it to a cute little starter house. Then came the sharpest blade. Cynthia crossed her arms and delivered the ultimate gaslighting accusation. "You know exactly what you are doing, Maya. You have deliberately poisoned those kids against their real mother. The only reason Malik yelled at us in the restaurant is because you spent over a decade brainwashing them. You filled their heads with lies because you are a barren, lonely woman who stole her sister's life. You could never get a man of your own, so you took Chloe's children to play pretend." The sheer cruelty of my own mother's words hit me like a freight train. She knew I had sacrificed my 20s, my dating life, and my freedom to raise her grandchildren. Yet she twisted my devotion into a malicious act of jealousy. I stood on the porch looking at the woman who gave birth to me, and I realized she was completely hollow inside. I did not shed a single tear. I refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing me break. I walked down the steps, closing the distance between Cynthia and me. I looked her dead in the eye with absolute ice. "You lost your daughter and your grandchildren the moment you chose a price tag over loyalty," I said quietly, so only she could hear. "And Chloe," I raised my voice, turning to look at my sister, who was hiding behind her husband's wealth. "No amount of Trent's money will ever erase the fact that you threw your children away like garbage. Get off my property before I call the police." Trent smirked, adjusting his expensive cuffs. "Do not worry, Maya," he called out, opening the door for his wife. "The courts will handle you soon enough. Enjoy the house while you still have it." They climbed into the sleek black SUV and drove away, leaving Cynthia to silently walk back to her own car, parked down the street. I stood on the lawn until their vehicles disappeared around the corner. I did not collapse. I did not panic. I immediately pulled my phone from my pocket and called a local locksmith. Within the hour, a professional crew was at my house. Every single deadbolt and handle on my doors was completely changed. I contacted a premier security firm and paid a premium fee to have commercial-grade cameras installed at every possible entry point before the sun went down. The mechanical process of securing my house felt like a metaphor for guarding my own heart. I was sealing the breaches, locking out the toxicity that threatened to destroy the sanctuary I had built. But the hardest part of the day was yet to come. When Malik and Aaliyah got off the school bus and walked through the front door, they immediately noticed the new locks and the security cameras blinking on the porch. I had to sit them down at the kitchen table and explain exactly what had happened while they were studying for their history exams. I watched the security and peace drain directly out of their teenage faces. Aaliyah started to cry, wrapping her arms around her own waist. She asked if the police were going to come take her away in the middle of the night. Malik clenched his fists, his jaw tight with anger, asking if he needed to stay home from track practice to guard the house. The psychological warfare had successfully breached our walls. My home, which had always been our safe haven, suddenly felt like a fortress under active siege. We ordered pizza for dinner, but the boxes sat on the counter completely untouched. The laughter and joy that normally filled our evenings was replaced by a heavy, suffocating anxiety. Every time a car drove past our window, Aaliyah flinched. Every time a shadow crossed the lawn, Malik stood up to check the new camera feeds on his phone. I sat at the head of the table holding their hands, promising them I would fight with every breath in my body to keep us together. But as I looked at the fear in their eyes, I knew the war had officially crossed my threshold. Chloe and Trent had infected our safe space, and I knew this was only the beginning of their ruthless campaign. The following week, the battleground shifted directly from my front lawn to the spaces where my kids were supposed to feel most secure. Since they could no longer breach the perimeter of our home, Trent and Chloe decided to weaponize their massive wealth to force a wedge between us. It started on a muggy Thursday afternoon right outside the chain-link fence of the high school athletic field. Malik had just finished leading his varsity track team through a grueling set of sprint intervals. He was walking out of the locker room, his heavy gym bag slung over his shoulder, exhausted but proud. That was when a gleaming jet-black Porsche Panamera slowly rolled to a stop, blocking the main exit gate of the student parking lot. The tinted window slid down, revealing Trent sitting in the driver's seat with Chloe beaming from the passenger side like they were filming a luxury car commercial. Trent stepped out of the six-figure vehicle, completely ignoring the staring high school athletes milling around the asphalt. He tossed a heavy set of keys directly at Malik. Malik caught them on pure reflex, looking down at the gleaming silver Porsche crest resting in his palm. Trent leaned against the hood of the sports car and offered a greasy salesman smile. He told Malik that every young man heading off to college needs a reliable ride to match his potential. He said the car was fully paid for, registered, and ready to drive away that very second. All Malik had to do was get in the driver's seat and drive it to their sprawling estate. Chloe leaned out the window, cooing loudly about how she just wanted to spoil her handsome boy after missing so many birthdays. She promised him a life of absolute luxury, where he would never have to worry about student loans or sharing a cramped bathroom ever again. Malik stood frozen on the asphalt for exactly 2 seconds. He looked at the heavy keys, then looked at the woman who gave birth to him. He did not yell or make a chaotic scene. He simply tossed the keys right back, hitting Trent directly in the chest, turned on his heel, and walked 2 miles to the public bus stop. When he walked through our front door that evening and told me what happened, his voice was shaking with a mixture of rage and profound disrespect. "They thought they could buy 14 years of my life with a car," he said, dropping his gym bag on the floor. I held him tightly, feeling a fierce pride swelling in my chest, but the relief was entirely short-lived. Realizing Malik was an immovable wall, they immediately pivoted their strategy to target the youngest. The very next Saturday, Aaliyah begged to go to the outdoor shopping promenade with 2 of her closest friends. She needed a desperate escape from the suffocating anxiety that had taken over our house. I hesitated, but eventually gave her a tight hug and dropped her off, wanting her to feel some semblance of a normal teenage life. I should have known better. Chloe had clearly hired someone to track their movements, because less than an hour later, Aaliyah was cornered. She was standing inside a high-end boutique looking at prom dresses when Chloe suddenly appeared from behind a rack of silk gowns. She trapped my 16-year-old niece, blocking the narrow aisle so Aaliyah could not easily walk away. Chloe played the role of the tragic, misunderstood mother flawlessly. She reached into her designer handbag and pulled out a heavy, matte black American Express card. She tried to force the cold metal into Aaliyah's trembling hand, whispering about how a beautiful girl deserves the best clothes, the best makeup, and a mother who can afford to give her the entire world. Chloe promised that the card had absolutely no limit. She told Aaliyah she could buy the entire store right then and there if she simply agreed to come over for one single dinner at Trent's mansion. Aaliyah was completely paralyzed. The other shoppers in the boutique were staring and whispering to each other as Chloe loudly lamented how much she missed her little princess. But Aaliyah possesses the exact same steel spine that I do. She looked at the limitless credit card and then looked directly into Chloe's eyes. Aaliyah told her that Maya already bought her everything she needed and forcefully pushed past the racks of expensive dresses, fleeing the store. She called me from the mall bathroom, hyperventilating. I broke several traffic laws getting there to bring her home securely, locking us inside our fortress once again. When their filthy money failed to break the loyalty of my children, Chloe and Trent resorted to absolute psychological warfare. If they could not buy the kids, they were going to manipulate the public into forcing my hand. Tuesday afternoon brought the ultimate terrifying escalation. The final bell had just rung at the high school, and hundreds of teenagers were pouring out of the main double doors into the crowded courtyard. Aaliyah was walking down the concrete steps holding her heavy backpack when a white news van aggressively pulled up to the curb. Before the campus security guards could even react, a local reporter and a man carrying a massive professional shoulder camera jumped out. Right behind them was Chloe. She had orchestrated an entire media spectacle, deliberately ambushing a minor on public school grounds. Chloe ran up the concrete steps, her face heavily contoured with waterproof makeup but perfectly arranged into a mask of pure devastation. She threw herself toward Aaliyah, wailing loudly enough for the microphone boom to pick up every single manufactured sob. She screamed about how her baby was being kept from her, how the wicked aunt had stolen her family, and how she just wanted to hold her daughter. The camera operator shoved the lens right into Aaliyah's face, capturing her complete terror. Teenagers surrounded them, instantly pulling out their own smartphones to record the chaos for social media. The flashing lights, the shouting reporter asking aggressive questions, and the suffocating crowd triggered a massive physiological response. Aaliyah could not breathe. She dropped her heavy backpack, her hands flying to her throat as her knees buckled. She collapsed right there on the concrete stairs, spiraling into a severe, terrifying panic attack. She was gasping for air, unable to process the sensory overload of her biological mother treating her like a prop for a daytime television drama. The school principal called me frantic, and I dropped my phone right on my office floor. I do not remember the drive to the school. I only remember the absolute tunnel vision of pure maternal fury. When I slammed my car into the bus lane, the crowd was still swarming. I shoved my way through the sea of teenagers throwing shoulders and ignoring the shouts of the security guards. I broke through the inner circle and saw Aaliyah curled into a tight ball on the steps, sobbing and hyperventilating, while Chloe knelt next to her, posing for the camera with a fake expression of maternal agony. I did not speak. I grabbed the camera operator's shoulder and violently shoved him backward, forcing the heavy lens away from my child. The reporter tried to shove a microphone into my face, asking how I felt about keeping a mother from her child. I slapped the microphone straight out of his hand, sending it clattering down the concrete stairs. I dropped to my knees, pulling Aaliyah into my chest, wrapping my blazer around her shaking shoulders and whispering that she was safe, that I had her, that nobody was going to touch her. Chloe stood up, wiping away a dry tear for the audience. "See how she acts," Chloe shouted to the crowd, gesturing wildly at me. "See how violent she is. This is the woman holding my children hostage." I stood up slowly, shielding Aaliyah entirely behind my body. I looked at the reporter picking up his broken equipment, and then I locked eyes with Chloe. I pointed a single shaking finger at her face. "If you ever come within 500 feet of my children again," I roared, my voice carrying across the entire courtyard, "I will not just file a restraining order. I will drag every single skeleton you have out of the closet and make sure the whole world sees exactly what kind of monster you really are. Get away from my daughter." I practically carried Aaliyah to my car, shoving her into the passenger seat and locking the doors tight. I drove us away from the flashing lights and the whispering crowds, but the damage was already done. By the time I managed to get Aaliyah home and calm her down with a cup of warm tea, the footage was everywhere. The local evening news played the clip of Chloe weeping on the school steps, painting her as a tragic hero fighting a corrupt system. Social media grabbed the smartphone videos and ran with them, completely warping the truth. Comment sections were filled with strangers calling me a bitter, barren woman who had kidnapped two innocent kids out of spite. The public narrative was spinning wildly out of my control, painting Trent and Chloe as the wealthy saviors and me as the deranged villain. They were manipulating the entire city to back them into a corner, making it impossible for me to fight without looking like the aggressor. The war had moved from my front lawn to the court of public opinion, and I was rapidly losing ground. The morning after the disastrous school ambush, I realized sheer willpower and righteous anger were no longer enough to protect my family. I was fighting a billionaire with endless resources and a complete lack of a moral compass. I needed a shark. I needed the kind of legal representation that made other lawyers sweat. That is exactly how I ended up sitting across a sprawling mahogany desk from Calvin. Calvin was a powerhouse attorney in downtown Atlanta, known for taking on high-profile family law and defense cases and completely destroying the opposition. He was a tall, impeccably dressed African-American man whose calm demeanor hid a razor-sharp legal mind. I had brought every single document I possessed, every medical bill I had ever paid for Malik and Aaliyah, every school report card, and most importantly, the worn yellowed manila folder containing the guardianship agreement from 14 years ago. I slid the folder across the polished wood of his desk. I explained everything from the steakhouse ambush to the home invasion and the terrifying media circus Chloe had orchestrated at the high school. Calvin listened without interrupting, his hands steepled under his chin. When I finished, he opened the folder and carefully extracted the single sheet of paper that had served as my shield for over a decade. He read the document twice. The silence in the spacious office grew heavier with each passing second. I watched his eyes scan the notary stamp, the signatures, the brief paragraph where Chloe had scrawled her consent. When Calvin finally looked up, his expression was entirely devoid of the confident reassurance I had been desperate to see. "Maya," he started, his voice gravely serious, "I need you to brace yourself. We have a massive problem." My chest tightened. I pointed at the paper, insisting that it was a legally binding document. I told him Chloe signed it in front of a state-certified notary before she vanished. I explained that it gave me full physical and legal guardianship, which allowed me to enroll them in school and make medical decisions. Calvin sighed, setting the paper down flat on the desk. "You are correct about what this document allowed you to do," he explained. "It granted you temporary guardianship. But Maya, temporary guardianship is not an adoption. You never formally petitioned the court to sever her biological rights. You never finalized a legal adoption process." I stared at him, feeling the air completely leave my lungs. I told him I was a broke 21-year-old college student working 3 jobs just to keep formula in the cabinet. I barely had money to pay my electric bill, let alone thousands of dollars for family court filing fees and an adoption attorney. I did what I had to do to survive and keep those kids out of the foster care system. Calvin held up a hand, acknowledging my struggle. "I am not judging you, Maya. What you did saved their lives, but we are not dealing in morality right now. We are dealing in cold, hard law. And the law says that because a judge never officially terminated Chloe's parental rights, she is still legally their mother. This document only gave you permission to act in her absence. It did not permanently strip her of her biological claim." The words rang in my ears like a death sentence. She was still legally their mother. 14 years of relentless sacrifice. 14 years of being the only parent who showed up to parent-teacher conferences and emergency room visits, and it all boiled down to a technicality. I gripped the arms of the leather guest chair, trying to stop my hands from shaking. I asked Calvin what that meant for us right now. "It means Trent's lawyers have a gaping loophole to exploit," Calvin said, leaning forward. "They do not have to prove you are a bad guardian. They just have to prove Chloe is now a fit mother who wants her children back and has revoked her temporary consent. And because she is married to Trent, they can present the court with a picture-perfect, wealthy 2-parent household." My mind raced. I told Calvin we had to fight it. I told him I would testify, I would bring character witnesses, I would show the court the 14 years of financial records, proving she never contributed a single dime to their upbringing. We will fight it, Calvin agreed. But you need to understand the kind of warfare Trent is waging. He did not hire standard family law attorneys. He hired a corporate litigation firm that treats custody battles like hostile corporate takeovers. They do not just want to win, they want to completely annihilate your ability to fight back. As if on cue, Calvin's desk phone buzzed with an urgent incoming email notification. He glanced at the screen, and his posture instantly rigidified. He clicked his mouse rapidly, pulling up a legal portal on his desktop monitor. I watched the color drain slightly from his face. "What is it?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Calvin turned the monitor toward me. It was a digital copy of a court order stamped and signed by a judge less than 20 minutes ago. Trent did not file this case in the standard family court rotation. Calvin explained, his voice tight with controlled anger. His legal team bypassed the usual channels and filed an emergency ex parte motion with Judge Harrison. Harrison is notoriously old school and heavily biased toward biological reunification. He heavily favors wealthy traditional families over single guardians. I stared at the dense legal jargon on the screen, unable to decipher the complicated paragraphs. I demanded Calvin tell me what the motion actually did. "They took the narrative from the high school incident and twisted it," Calvin said, pointing to a specific clause in the document. "They used the footage of you shoving the camera operator and yelling at Chloe. They presented it to Judge Harrison as proof that you are volatile, violent, and an immediate threat to the children. They claimed you are a flight risk who might attempt to conceal the minors to prevent a biological reunification." My jaw dropped. They provoked me into defending my daughter from a media ambush and used my protective instincts to paint me as an unhinged aggressor. But that is not the worst part. Calvin continued, delivering the final devastating blow. "Because Trent's lawyers also filed civil charges, claiming you alienated the children's affection and fraudulently profited off acting as their mother, they requested a preliminary injunction on all your assets. Judge Harrison granted it." I blinked, uncomprehending. I asked him to explain what that meant for my agency. "It means your accounts are frozen," Maya Calvin stated bluntly. "As of this morning, they have successfully placed a freeze on your personal bank accounts, your savings, and your branding agency's operating accounts. Everything is locked, pending a full investigation into the kidnapping and alienation allegations." The room started to spin. I stood up from the chair, my legs feeling like lead. Frozen. My agency accounts were frozen. I had payroll to meet on Friday. I had 15 loyal employees depending on me to feed their own families. I had vendors to pay office rent to cover and active advertising campaigns that required daily capital. My entire business, the empire I built from absolute scratch, was suddenly paralyzed. I pulled my cell phone from my purse and immediately opened my banking application. A red error message flashed across the screen stating my access was temporarily suspended due to a legal hold. I tried my business banking app. The exact same red banner appeared. I was completely locked out of my own life. Trent knew exactly what he was doing. He knew he could not easily rip two teenagers out of the only home they had ever known just by asking nicely. He knew Malik and Aaliyah would fight tooth and nail to stay with me, so he changed the rules of engagement. He was not trying to win a fair fight in a courtroom. He was cutting off my oxygen supply. "He wants to starve me out," I whispered, staring at the red error message on my phone. "He wants to bankrupt my company so I cannot afford to pay you. He wants me to lose the house so I cannot provide a stable environment for the kids. He is trying to make me look unfit by destroying my finances." Calvin nodded solemnly, closing the legal portal on his screen. "It is a classic corporate siege tactic applied to a family dispute. If you cannot afford to mount a defense, you will be forced to default. If your business goes under, you lose your standing as a stable provider. He is trying to force you into a corner where your only option is to surrender the children just to survive." I gripped the edge of Calvin's mahogany desk, my knuckles turning white. The sheer evil of Trent's strategy was breathtaking. He did not care that shutting down my agency would destroy the livelihoods of my innocent employees. He did not care about the emotional trauma he was inflicting on Malik and Aaliyah. He viewed us all as acceptable collateral damage in his twisted game of power and control. Calvin looked at me with deep concern. Maya, I need to be honest with you. Fighting an ex parte asset freeze takes time. We have to file a motion to dissolve the injunction, get a hearing scheduled, and present counter evidence. The court system moves slowly, and Trent's lawyers will file endless discovery requests to delay the process. It could be weeks before you can access a single dollar. I looked away from Calvin, staring blankly at the wall of thick law books behind him. Weeks without access to capital meant my agency would completely fold. My clients would panic and leave. My reputation in the Atlanta business community would be entirely shredded. Everything I had sacrificed my youth to build was being snatched away by a man who had not even known my name a month ago. Do we have any options? I asked, my voice hard and flat. I will file the emergency appeals immediately. Calvin promised, standing up. I will petition the court to release at least the business operating funds to protect your employees. But Maya, you need to prepare for the reality that things are going to get much worse before they get better. Trent is trying to break you. I grabbed my purse, throwing its strap over my shoulder. I felt a cold, absolute resolve settling over my panic. Trent thought freezing my accounts would send me crawling to him in tears. He thought stripping away my money would strip away my power. He fundamentally misunderstood who he was dealing with. He forgot that I built my entire life when I had absolutely nothing in my pockets but loose change and sheer desperation. I thanked Calvin for his honesty and told him to file the appeals. I walked out of that high-rise law office into the sweltering Atlanta heat, my mind operating with total lethal clarity. Trent wanted to play corporate warfare using my family as chess pieces. He wanted to suffocate my agency and force my surrender. I was not going to sit around waiting for the court system to save me. I was going to take the fight directly to his front door. I drove straight from Calvin's office back to my branding agency. The Atlanta traffic was brutal, but I barely registered the sea of cars surrounding me. My mind was rapidly calculating the exact financial runway I had left. With my accounts completely frozen by Judge Harrison, I had exactly $0 to operate. I parked my car in my reserved spot and walked into the reception area of the building. I had designed this space with my own two hands. The exposed brick walls, the sleek mid-century furniture, the vibrant energy of my 15 employees collaborating on major advertising campaigns. This was my empire. I built this from absolutely nothing. And Trent thought he could just flip a switch and turn the lights off. Before I could even reach my private office, my lead account director, Marcus, intercepted me. His face was entirely pale, and his usual confident posture was rigid with panic. He handed me his digital tablet without saying a single word. I looked down at the screen and felt the floor completely drop out from under me. It was an email forwarded from our biggest corporate client, a national retail chain that accounted for 40% of our annual revenue. The email had been sent from an encrypted anonymous server, but the malicious intent was crystal clear. It was a surgical character assassination designed to destroy my life. The subject line read "Urgent legal notice regarding agency ownership," and it contained a heavily edited video file. I tapped the screen and watched my own face appear. It was the footage from the high school courtyard, but it was cut to remove Chloe entirely. It removed the aggressive reporter and the camera operator shoving equipment into my niece's face. It only showed me slapping the microphone away and screaming aggressively. Attached to the video was a fabricated legal summary claiming the owner of this branding agency was currently under active federal investigation for child abduction and violent physical assault. My phone started ringing. Then the main office lines started lighting up like a Christmas tree. Over the next 2 hours, I sat at my desk and watched 14 years of my life's work bleed out right in front of my eyes. Our top 3 clients called to officially suspend their contracts, citing strict morality clauses and corporate liability. I tried to reason with them. I spoke to a long-term client named David, who had trusted me with his branding for a decade. He sounded genuinely apologetic, but he explained that his corporate compliance board forced his hand. They simply could not risk their brand being associated with an active kidnapping investigation. Then the vendors started calling. The commercial printing companies, the media buyers, the digital ad space coordinators. Someone had tipped them off that my financial assets were frozen. They demanded immediate cash payments for services we had already contracted months ago. These were payments I physically could not authorize because Trent's legal team had locked every single penny I owned behind a judicial wall. My finance manager stood in my doorway close to tears, asking how we were going to make payroll on Friday. I had 15 loyal employees depending on me to feed their own families and pay their mortgages. My entire business was suddenly paralyzed and the panic in the office was suffocating. I stared out the large window of my office, looking at the hazy Atlanta skyline. Chloe was nowhere near smart enough to orchestrate a coordinated corporate attack of this magnitude. This was all Trent. This was the raw, unchecked power of billionaire wealth. He was not just trying to win a custody battle in family court. He was systematically destroying my public reputation, my livelihood, and my ability to survive. He wanted me completely destitute. He wanted me so utterly broken that I would not even be able to afford gas in my car to drive to the courthouse. He viewed me as a minor inconvenience, a pest he could squash with a few strategic phone calls and some highly paid fixers. I looked at the framed photograph sitting on my glass desk. It was Malik and Aaliyah smiling brightly at Malik's middle school graduation. They were my reason for everything. I had worked double shifts, skipped meals, and fought through absolute crushing poverty to make sure they never felt the sting of abandonment again. Trent thought stripping away my money would strip away my power. He fundamentally misunderstood the kind of woman he provoked. Wealth is just paper. Power is what you do when the paper is gone. I stood up, grabbed my tailored blazer, and walked out to the main bullpen. I looked at my terrified employees and spoke with absolute, unwavering authority. I told my staff to forward all incoming calls to voicemail and lock the front doors of the building. I told them not to speak to any reporters and not to reply to any anonymous emails. I promised them their paychecks would clear on Friday, even if I had to sell my own car to make it happen. I told them I was going to fix this right now. I drove directly to the financial district in Buckhead. Trent's corporate headquarters occupied the top 10 floors of a massive, gleaming glass skyscraper. The building was designed specifically to be intimidating, a modern fortress of elite wealth and exclusivity. I strode through the revolving glass doors into the cavernous marble lobby. The main security desk was flanked by armed guards and electronic turnstiles that required encrypted keycard access. I did not belong in this building, and the security guards knew it instantly. They looked at me with immediate suspicion, preparing to step forward and ask for my credentials. But I did not give them the chance to stop me. I saw a group of high-level executives in expensive tailored suits walking briskly toward the VIP elevators. I adjusted my blazer, lifted my chin, and walked with the absolute authority of a woman who owned the entire building. It is a psychological trick I learned years ago when pitching to massive corporate boards. If you walk like you own the space, people naturally move out of your way. I fell into step right behind the executives, mirroring their confident, hurried stride. The security guards hesitated for just a second, unsure if I was part of the legal team or a visiting executive. That single second of hesitation was all the time I needed. I slipped through the electronic turnstile right behind the men, stepping onto the polished floor of the executive elevator, just as the brushed steel doors slid shut. The elevator shot upward, my ears popping slightly as we rapidly bypassed 60 floors of corporate offices. The executives stepped off on floor 65, leaving me entirely alone in the mirrored box for the final ascent. I watched the digital numbers above the door climb higher and higher. Floor 70. The top of the tower, Trent's personal domain. The elevator doors opened with a soft electronic chime, revealing a massive reception area that looked more like a modern art museum than an office. A receptionist sat behind a massive curved marble desk, her eyes widening in shock as I stepped off the elevator unescorted. She immediately reached for her desk phone to call security, but I walked right past her, completely ignoring her loud demands to stop. I marched down the wide hallway, my heels sinking into the plush carpet. I did not need to ask for directions. I knew exactly which office was his. It was the one with the massive frosted glass double doors at the very end of the hall, claiming the best view of the city. My heart was hammering a furious rhythm against my ribs, but my hands were completely steady. I did not knock. I did not ask for permission. I reached out, pushed both heavy glass doors open with absolute force, and stepped directly into the lion's den to confront the man trying to destroy my family. I walked out of his lavish boardroom, keeping my head lowered, and my shoulders slumped until I reached the elevator bank. The heavy steel doors closed, shutting me inside the private elevator car. The moment I was completely alone, the tears instantly stopped. I wiped the moisture from my cheeks with the back of my hand and stood up perfectly straight. I tasted the blood in my mouth and smiled a cold, terrifying smile. Trent thought he had just successfully executed a brilliant corporate raid. He thought he had backed me into an inescapable corner. He had no idea he had just given me exactly what I needed. He gave me 48 hours. 48 hours was a lifetime for a woman who knew how to survive. I was not going to gather surrender paperwork. I was going back to my office to launch a covert counteroffensive that would rip his entire pristine billionaire life to shreds. The countdown had officially started, and I was preparing to go to war. The heavy frosted glass doors had slammed against the interior walls of the boardroom with a thunderous crash when I first entered. Trent had been seated at the far end of a massive polished mahogany conference table that looked long enough to seat 30 people. He was not alone. Two men in sharp gray suits were packing up legal briefs into leather briefcases. The receptionist who had chased me down the hallway was hovering behind me, panting and frantically apologizing to Trent, saying she had tried to stop me. Trent did not flinch. He did not look surprised or alarmed by my sudden violent entrance. Instead, a slow, deeply arrogant smile spread across his face. He raised a single hand and gestured lazily for the receptionist and the two suited men to leave us. He told them he would handle the situation. The men quickly shuffled past me, avoiding my eyes entirely, and the receptionist pulled the heavy glass doors shut behind them. The click of the magnetic lock echoed in the cavernous room, leaving me entirely alone with the man actively trying to destroy my existence. I had walked forward, my heels clicking sharply against the imported marble floor. I stopped exactly halfway down the length of the conference table, refusing to approach him like a subordinate seeking permission. I stared at him with unblinking intensity. I told him to call his attack dogs off right now. I demanded that he lift the freeze on my agency operating accounts and drop the ridiculous kidnapping narrative before I dragged his entire corporate reputation through the mud. Trent leaned back in his plush leather executive chair, crossing his legs and resting his hands casually on his stomach. The concerned stepfather acted the righteous indignation he had displayed at the high school and the restaurant completely vanished. There was no pretense of familial love in his eyes. There was only cold, calculating corporate greed. He looked at me the way a predator looks at cornered prey. He let out a low, chuckling sound that made my skin crawl. He told me I had a lot of fire for a woman whose entire financial life was currently bleeding out on the pavement. He stood up slowly, buttoning his custom navy suit jacket, and began pacing the length of the room, his expensive leather shoes completely silent on the floor. He dropped the facade entirely. He stated flatly that he did not care about Malik or Aaliyah. He called them loud, obnoxious teenagers who would never fit into his pristine lifestyle. He admitted that Chloe did not care about them either. He said Chloe despised the idea of suddenly playing mother to two nearly grown teenagers when she preferred spending her afternoons at the country club spa. He looked me dead in the eye and confessed that the tears at the school, the dramatic scene at the restaurant, and the frantic calls to the police were nothing but a carefully choreographed performance. My blood ran ice cold as the reality of his words washed over me. I asked him why he was doing this if neither of them wanted the kids. I asked why he was spending thousands of dollars on high-priced litigation attorneys to rip my family apart. Trent stopped pacing and leaned his hands flat against the polished mahogany table, leaning toward me. Because you built something valuable, Maya. he said, his voice dripping with pure greed. He explained that his corporate portfolio was looking to acquire a successful urban branding agency to diversify their holdings. He had seen my profit margins. He had seen my client list. He had seen the empire I built from absolute scratch. But instead of making a legitimate buyout offer like a decent businessman, he decided a hostile takeover would be significantly cheaper. He reached inside his suit jacket, pulled out a folded legal document, and tossed it across the smooth surface of the table. The thick paper slid and stopped exactly in front of my hands. He laid out his ruthless ultimatum. He told me to read the document. It was an irrevocable transfer of ownership. He demanded 80% equity in my branding agency handed over directly to him and Chloe. If I signed my company away, he promised to make a few phone calls. He said the emergency custody motion would be magically withdrawn by the end of the day. The federal kidnapping allegations would be formally dropped as a tragic family misunderstanding. The civil suit for alienation of affection would vanish into thin air. Most importantly, the judicial freeze on my personal and business accounts would be lifted immediately, allowing me to make my Friday payroll and save my employees. I stared down at the crisp white paper resting on the table. My heart was pounding so violently against my ribs, I thought it might shatter my chest. He was extorting me. He was using the children I loved more than my own breath as leverage to steal the business I had sacrificed my entire youth to build. My family did not return to Atlanta out of regret or newfound maternal love. They returned for a massive payday. Chloe had sold me out to a corporate raider, and Trent was executing the heist with terrifying precision. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to lunge across the table. I wanted to tear the smug grin off his face. I wanted to rip the contract to shreds and throw it in the trash. I wanted to scream that I would rather burn my agency to the ground than hand over a single percentage to the woman who abandoned my niece and nephew. But the cold, hard reality of the situation anchored my feet to the floor. I had exactly $0 available to my name. My lawyer's hands were tied by the swiftness of the ex parte motion. My clients were fleeing. My employees were terrified. If I fought him right now with nothing but anger, I would lose everything. I would lose the agency, I would lose the house, and without financial stability, I would inevitably lose custody of Malik and Aaliyah. I could not fight a billionaire with an empty bank account. I needed a strategy, and above all else, I needed time. So I did the only thing I could do. I swallowed my pride. I bit down on the soft inside of my cheek, clamping my teeth into the flesh until I tasted the sharp, metallic tang of copper blood. The intense physical pain brought a rush of immediate hot tears to my eyes. I let my shoulders slump forward, collapsing the strong, confident posture I had carried into the room. I let my hands tremble as I reached out and touched the edge of the contract. I put on the greatest performance of my entire life. I looked up at Trent, letting the tears spill over my eyelashes and run down my cheeks. I let my voice crack and splinter, playing the part of a totally defeated, broken woman. I begged him. I told him I had poured my soul into the agency. I pleaded with him to understand that my employees had families to feed and that freezing the accounts was destroying innocent lives. I stammered and cried, asking how Chloe could do this to her own sister. Trent drank in my desperation like it was fine wine. His smile widened, stretching across his face in absolute triumph. He stood taller, visibly swelling with the satisfaction of crushing a self-made woman under his expensive heel. He thrived on my tears. He viewed my emotional breakdown as the ultimate victory, validating his twisted sense of superiority. I forced myself to sound incredibly small and weak. I told him I would sign the agency over. I said I could not bear to lose Malik and Aaliyah, and I would give him whatever he wanted if he just promised to leave us alone. But I begged him for a little bit of time. I told him 80% equity transfer required complex legal and financial restructuring. I wept, saying I needed to organize my client portfolios, transfer administrative accesses, and quietly restructure the payroll so my employees would not panic when the new ownership took over. I looked at the floor, shrinking myself down, and begged him for just 48 hours to gather the surrender paperwork and make the transition smooth. I promised I would bring the signed notarized contract to his lawyer's office by Friday morning. Trent walked around the table and stood looking down at me. He was completely convinced he had broken my spirit. He saw a weeping, desperate mother willing to trade her empire for her children. He did not see the lethal rage boiling just beneath the surface of my tears. He reached out and patted my shoulder patronizingly, a gesture that took every ounce of my willpower not to physically reject. He told me I was finally making a smart business decision. He agreed to give me exactly 48 hours to get my affairs in order. He warned me that if I tried to run or pull a fast one, he would ruin me so thoroughly I would never work in the state of Georgia again. He told me to dry my tears and be grateful he was allowing me to keep 20% of my own company. I nodded, keeping my eyes downcast, and clutched the blank contract to my chest like a lifeline. I whispered a pathetic broken thank you and turned toward the door. The moment the heavy glass doors of Trent's corporate fortress closed behind me, the suffocating Georgia heat hit my face like a physical blow. I did not rush to my car. I walked with deliberate, measured steps, projecting the image of a completely shattered woman, just in case Trent's security team was watching me from the towering windows above. I unlocked my car door, slid into the driver's seat, and gripped the leather steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. The 48-hour countdown had officially begun. Trent assumed my next move would be running back to my office to draft the surrender documents for my branding agency. He assumed my frozen bank accounts had rendered me completely helpless. He forgot one crucial detail about my background. You do not grow up broke on the south side of Atlanta and build a multi-million-dollar business without learning how to hide a rainy day fund entirely off the grid. I drove straight to my house, bypassing the agency completely. I checked the new security cameras, ensuring the perimeter was clear, before heading straight down into the unfinished section of my basement. Behind a stack of old holiday decorations and a heavy shelving unit was a loose concrete block in the foundation. I pulled it away, revealing a heavy, fireproof lockbox. I spun the combination dial and opened the heavy lid. Inside sat exactly $25,000 in crisp $100 bills. It was the emergency stash I had built over 14 years, a physical safety net, tucked away for a catastrophic disaster that digital banks and malicious judges could never touch. I grabbed a thick stack of the cash, shoved it into a plain brown envelope, and walked back up the stairs. It was time to hire a monster of my own. I could not use Calvin for this specific phase of the counteroffensive. Calvin's firm was bound by strict legal ethics and conventional discovery processes that would take weeks to yield results. I did not have weeks. I had barely 2 days. I needed someone who operated comfortably in the gray areas of corporate espionage. I needed Silas. Silas was an ex-federal investigator who had been forced into early private practice. He was brilliant, ruthless, and possessed a terrifying talent for tearing apart the financial and personal histories of the wealthy elite. We had crossed paths years ago when my agency handled crisis management branding for a client he was investigating. I drove to a nondescript retro diner on the outskirts of the city, a place where the coffee tasted like burnt copper and nobody asked questions. Silas was already sitting in a back booth wearing a faded denim jacket and nursing a black coffee. I slid into the booth across from him and pushed the thick brown envelope across the sticky laminate table. Silas did not even look inside. He simply placed his large hand over the cash and raised an eyebrow, waiting for his instructions. I gave him the target. Trent Thornton. I told Silas I needed everything stripped down to the studs. I needed to know about Trent's offshore accounts, his recent corporate acquisitions, and his sudden, highly suspicious marriage to my sister Chloe. But most importantly, I leaned across the table and lowered my voice. I told Silas to find out why a billionaire who openly despised teenagers was spending a fortune in legal fees to steal a mid-sized branding agency and claim emergency custody of a niece and nephew he had absolutely zero biological connection to. I suspected Trent was hiding a massive financial vulnerability or leveraging the kids for a larger corporate play. There was a missing puzzle piece, and I needed Silas to find it immediately. Silas tapped his fingers against the envelope, nodded once, and slid out of the booth. He promised me answers by tomorrow morning. With Silas digging into Trent's present, I needed to dig into Chloe's past. I drove my car away from the diner, my mind tracing a path back 15 years. When Chloe had dumped Malik and Aaliyah on my studio apartment porch that rainy Tuesday, she had left behind a single cheap duffel bag packed with soiled clothes and broken toys. But zipped away in the tiny hidden side pocket of that duffel bag was something Chloe had likely forgotten she even possessed. It was a small brass key etched with a series of serial numbers. It belonged to a safety deposit box at a small independent bank branch across town. The box had not belonged to Chloe. It belonged to the kid's biological father. I had never met the man. He was a shadow in our lives, a brief chapter in Chloe's chaotic youth, who had passed away in a tragic accident 15 years ago, just a year before Chloe abandoned the children. Chloe had never cared enough to investigate what he left behind. She was too obsessed with chasing her next party to deal with a dead man's paperwork. But I had kept the key. Even when I was a broke college student struggling to buy groceries, I had walked into that bank every single January and paid the nominal annual cash fee to keep the box active. I had promised myself I would open it and give its contents to Malik on his 18th birthday, so he could have some small piece of the father he never knew. Malik had just turned 18 this week. The timing was almost poetic. I pulled into the parking lot of the aging brick bank building. The afternoon sun was beginning to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the pavement. I walked through the glass doors, approached the teller, and presented my identification, along with the annual renewal receipts I had meticulously filed away for over a decade. The bank manager, an older gentleman with a gentle demeanor, verified my signature and led me down into the quiet, secure vault in the basement. The heavy steel door locked behind us with a solid mechanical thud. He pointed me to a wall of small metal squares, inserted his master key into the slot, and allowed me to insert the brass key I had carried for 14 years. We turned them simultaneously. The small metal door popped open. The manager respectfully excused himself, leaving me entirely alone in the silent, sterile vault. I reached into the narrow, dark space and pulled out a heavy rectangular metal tin. My hands were trembling slightly as I carried it over to the small private viewing table in the center of the room. I sat down, taking a deep breath to steady my racing heart. I unlatched the hinges and opened the lid. A faint smell of old paper and stale cologne drifted up from the contents. Inside the box there was no money. There were no valuable jewels or rare coins. Instead, the box was packed tightly with thick stacks of legal documents, sealed letters, and a small velvet jewelry box. I reached for the velvet box first. I snapped it open and found a heavy, solid gold signet ring resting on the dark cushion. The ring was deeply engraved with an intricate family crest featuring a soaring falcon and a highly distinctive interlocking double T monogram. It was an unmistakable symbol of generational wealth. A symbol that felt completely disconnected from the struggling man Chloe had briefly described to me 15 years ago. I set the ring aside and picked up the first stack of papers. They were birth certificates. Not just Malik and Aaliyah's original long-form birth certificates, but also the birth certificate of their biological father. I scanned the faded printed text, reading the name of the man who had fathered my niece and nephew. My eyes traced across his given name and then slowly moved to his listed surname. I stopped breathing. The letters on the page seemed to blur and then snap back into terrifying hyper-focus. The surname was not the generic fake name Chloe had always used when referring to him. The surname printed on the official state document was Thornton. I dropped the birth certificate onto the table, my mind spinning violently as the implications crashed over me like a tidal wave. Thornton. Trent's last name was Thornton. I scrambled to open the next stack of documents, tearing through the heavy parchment paper with frantic urgency. I found a thick-bound legal portfolio bearing the official seal of a massive corporate estate planning firm. The document was an ancient trust declaration. I flipped through the dense legal jargon, my eyes desperately scanning for anything that made sense of this impossible connection. I found a family tree appendix attached to the back of the trust document. The family tree laid out the entire lineage of a sprawling billionaire empire. At the top was a patriarch, a man whose name I recognized from recent financial news headlines. Below him were listed two sons. The younger son was listed as Trent Thornton. The older son, the firstborn heir to the entire corporate dynasty, was listed with the exact same name printed on the birth certificate of Malik and Aaliyah's deceased father. I fell back against the hard wooden chair in the silent bank vault, my hand covering my mouth to stifle a shocked gasp. The pieces of the puzzle slammed together with devastating clarity. Trent was not a random wealthy stranger who had swept my sister off her feet. Trent was the biological uncle of the two teenagers he was currently trying to rip from my home. The man Chloe had a fleeting relationship with 15 years ago was Trent's estranged older brother. He had walked away from his toxic billionaire family to live a normal, quiet life, a life that was cut tragically short. I looked back down at the documents, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm. I ripped open the sealed letters resting at the bottom of the tin box. They were handwritten notes from the older brother, detailing his desperate attempts to secure his children's future before his untimely death. He had known his wealthy family was deeply corrupt. He had known his younger brother Trent was a ruthless corporate vulture. He had hidden these documents specifically to protect Malik and Aaliyah from being swallowed by the Thornton empire. The 48-hour clock was ticking, but the entire battlefield had just shifted beneath my feet. Trent was not trying to extort my branding agency because he wanted a new business asset. The agency was just a smokescreen, a convenient way to crush my finances and force me into surrendering custody. He needed legal guardianship of Malik and Aaliyah. He needed to possess the children because they were the direct biological heirs to the Thornton family dynasty. I gathered every single document, every letter, and the gold signet ring, placing them carefully into my leather tote bag. Trent thought he had backed a desperate single mother into a corner. He had no idea he had just handed me the keys to his complete and total destruction. The drive from the bank vault to Silas's unmarked office felt like moving through a surreal nightmare. I gripped the leather steering wheel of my car until my knuckles ached. The metal tin sat on the passenger seat, radiating the terrible weight of its contents. Trent Thornton was not a random wealthy businessman who happened to fall in love with my sister. Trent was Malik and Aaliyah's biological uncle. Their biological father was his deceased older brother. The man Chloe had dismissed as a fleeting mistake 15 years ago was the firstborn son of a billionaire dynasty. And Chloe had known, she had to have known. I pulled into the gravel lot behind the dilapidated warehouse where Silas operated. The Georgia heat was oppressive, but my blood ran completely ice-cold. I grabbed the heavy metal box and marched up the rusted iron stairs to his office. Silas was waiting behind a desk piled high with disorganized case files and empty coffee cups. When he saw my face, his posture shifted instantly. He did not offer a greeting. He simply pointed to the empty chair across from him and pushed a thick manila folder across the battered wood. "You were right to dig," Maya Silas said, his voice entirely devoid of emotion. "Trent Thornton is not trying to buy your branding agency. He is trying to steal an empire." I dropped the metal tin onto his desk. I opened it and pulled out the birth certificates and the heavy gold signet ring. I told him I already knew about the bloodline. I told him Malik and Aaliyah were Thorntons. Silas stared at the documents and let out a low whistle. He leaned back in his squeaking leather chair and crossed his arms. "That is only half the puzzle," he said, sliding his folder toward me. "Open it." I flipped the heavy cardstock cover open. Inside were copies of death certificates, corporate filings, and a highly confidential estate document. Silas began speaking rapidly, laying out the massive financial conspiracy with terrifying precision. He explained that Arthur Thornton, the patriarch of the Thornton family empire, and Trent's father had passed away exactly 32 days ago. Arthur despised Trent. He viewed his younger son as a reckless corporate vulture with zero moral compass. Arthur had legally severed Trent from the primary executive control of the dynasty years ago. But Arthur was fiercely traditional. Silas continued, pointing to a highlighted section of the estate document. Arthur's will dictates that the entire primary family trust, valued at roughly $300 million, completely bypasses Trent. The will explicitly states that control of the trust and the majority voting shares of the corporate empire immediately vest to the firstborn grandson upon his 18th birthday. My heart stopped beating. I stared at Silas, the realization hitting me with the force of a physical blow. Malik. Malik was the firstborn grandson. Malik had just turned 18 this week. Trent found out about the will, Silas explained. He knew his older brother had a son before he died. He knew Malik was out there. If Malik claims his inheritance, Trent loses everything. He loses the company, he loses the wealth, and he loses his entire legacy. But Trent is smart. He realized that if he could gain legal financial guardianship over Malik, he could control the entire $300 million trust. He could raid the accounts, manipulate the corporate voting shares, and bleed the empire dry before Malik even understood what he possessed. I felt physically sick. The steakhouse ambush, the home invasion, the fake tears at the high school. It was all a calculated performance. Trent did not marry Chloe out of love. He married her because she was the biological mother of the golden ticket. By marrying Chloe, he established a legal relationship with the heir. But he needed physical custody to petition the court for full financial guardianship, and I was standing directly in his way. "He needs you gone," Maya, Silas said softly. "He froze your accounts to bankrupt you so you would default on the custody battle. He offered to take your agency in exchange for dropping the kidnapping charges because he wanted you completely financially ruined and desperate. If you surrender those kids, he wins the lottery." I closed the folder, my hands shaking with absolute unchecked rage. My sister, my own flesh and blood, had sold her children out to a corporate predator. She had to know. Chloe was greedy and selfish, but she was not stupid. She had kept the safety deposit box key. She knew the Thornton name. She had struck a deal with the devil to gain access to a billionaire lifestyle, actively helping him orchestrate the theft of her own son's birthright. I looked at Silas, and my voice dropped to a lethal whisper. I told him I needed to destroy them. I told him I wanted every single piece of dirt he could find. I needed to know exactly how Trent and Chloe connected. I needed to prove the marriage was a fraudulent sham designed exclusively for extortion. Silas nodded, pulling a flash drive from his pocket and sliding it across the desk. "It is all right here." I pulled Trent's private communications. They met 6 months ago, shortly after Trent learned about his father's failing health. There are financial transfers from Trent's offshore accounts directly into Chloe's personal banking. He paid her off. He essentially purchased her biological rights. The rage inside me crystallized into something cold, hard, and unbreakable. I gathered the documents, the flash drive, the birth certificates, and the heavy gold ring. I shoved them all into my leather tote bag. The 48-hour countdown was almost over. Trent thought he had successfully broken a desperate single mother. He thought I was spending these hours weeping over my frozen bank accounts and drafting surrender documents for my branding agency. He fundamentally misunderstood the kind of woman he provoked. I was not going to surrender my agency. I was going to let him walk into a legally binding trap. I thanked Silas and walked out of the warehouse, the humid Atlanta air doing nothing to thaw the ice in my veins. I called Calvin from the parking lot and told him to prepare for absolute war. The next morning, I arrived at Trent's corporate high-rise exactly on time. I wore a sharp, tailored black suit, my hair pulled back tightly, my expression carefully crafted to project total defeat. I carried a thin leather portfolio containing absolutely nothing but blank sheets of paper. I took the private executive elevator up to the 70th floor. My heart steady, my mind focused entirely on the execution of the trap. Trent and Chloe were waiting for me in the massive mahogany boardroom. They were not alone. Cynthia was sitting at the far end of the table sipping sparkling water from a crystal glass. The betrayal stung anew seeing my mother actively participating in my destruction, but I pushed the pain aside. Trent's high-priced corporate lawyers flanked him, their briefcases open, their pens, ready to execute the hostile takeover of my branding agency. Chloe looked at me with a smug, triumphant smile, adjusting her diamond tennis bracelet. Trent leaned back in his executive chair, exuding the arrogant confidence of a man who believed he had already won. He gestured lazily to the empty chair across from him, demanding I present the signed transfer documents. I sat down slowly, keeping my eyes lowered. I placed my portfolio on the polished wood. I told Trent I needed to confirm the terms of the agreement on the record before I signed anything. I pulled a small digital recording device from my pocket and placed it visibly on the table, stating that I required a verbal confirmation of his extortion to ensure he actually dropped the kidnapping charges. Trent's lawyers immediately objected, but Trent waved them off. He was too arrogant, too blinded by his own perceived victory, to see the snare closing around his ankles. He laughed, telling me I had no leverage to make demands, but agreed to state the terms if it made me feel better about surrendering my empire. I looked directly at Chloe first. I asked her point blank if she had any knowledge of who Malik's biological father actually was. I asked her if she knew the Thornton family name 15 years ago. Chloe scoffed, rolling her eyes. She performed flawlessly for the room, claiming the father was a random nobody, a fleeting mistake from her youth, whose last name she never even bothered to learn. She swore she had no idea about Trent's family connection until recently, insisting their marriage was based purely on sudden, unexpected love. I turned my attention to Trent. I asked him to confirm that he was demanding 80% equity in my branding agency in direct exchange for dropping the federal kidnapping allegations and the emergency custody injunction. I asked him to confirm that his primary interest was simply securing a stable two-parent home for his new stepchildren. Trent leaned forward, lacing his fingers together. He stared at me with pure, condescending malice. He confirmed every single detail. He stated on the record that he was taking my business as compensation for my supposed alienation of affection. He claimed he wanted custody solely to manage the children's future financial estates, ensuring they were raised with proper wealthy guidance rather than scraping by in my suburban home. He said the words perfectly. He admitted to the extortion. He admitted his focus was financial control. Chloe perjured herself by denying knowledge of the bloodline. Cynthia sat silently, validating their fraudulent narrative. They had built a towering house of lies on a legally binding recording. They tied their own nooses without realizing I was holding the rope. I reached into my leather portfolio, but I did not pull out the surrender documents. I pulled out the thick manila envelope Silas had given me. The 48 hours were up, and I was ready to burn their world to the ground. The morning of the deposition, the Atlanta air was thick with humidity, but inside Trent's corporate high-rise, the atmosphere was absolutely frigid. Calvin and I walked into the massive glass-walled conference room exactly on time. Trent, Chloe, and Cynthia were already seated across the expansive mahogany table. They looked like a perfectly staged, wealthy family straight out of a glossy magazine spread. Trent wore a custom-tailored gray suit, his posture radiating the arrogance of a man who believed he held all the winning cards. Chloe was dressed in a conservative, high-necked beige dress, a deliberate departure from her usual flashy designer labels, clearly instructed by her legal team to project an image of modest maternal grace. Cynthia sat next to her, clutching a leather handbag, looking at me with an expression of pure, unadulterated contempt. Trent's lead attorney, a sharp-featured man named Sterling, adjusted his glasses and clicked his gold pen. A court stenographer sat quietly at the end of the table, her fingers poised over her machine, ready to capture every single word on the official legal record. Calvin sat beside me, opening his sleek leather portfolio with practiced calmness. I placed my hands flat on the polished wood, keeping my face entirely blank. I did not look at the heavy manila envelope resting securely inside my tote bag on the floor. Sterling began the proceedings by formally stating the purpose of the mediation. He droned on about exploring potential settlement options regarding the custody injunction and the pending civil litigation against my branding agency. He spoke in dense legal jargon, but the underlying threat was unmistakable. Surrender the company or face total financial annihilation. Calvin leaned forward, steepling his fingers. He stated for the record that we were present to hear their terms, but emphasized that my primary concern remained the stability and welfare of the two minors Malik and Aliyah. That was all the opening Chloe needed. She launched into a performance that deserved an Academy Award. She pulled a perfectly pressed linen handkerchief from her purse and began to dab at her completely dry eyes. I was just so young. Chloe started, her voice trembling with manufactured emotion. The stenographer's fingers flew across the keys, capturing the lies. I was barely 23. I was overwhelmed and suffering from severe postpartum depression. I never meant to leave my babies, Maya. I just needed a few days to find myself, to seek help. But you locked me out. You changed your number. You disappeared and hid my children from me for 14 long years. I did not flinch. I did not interject. I let her weave the rope. Calvin sat silently, allowing the opposition to control the narrative. I have spent every single day agonizing over the loss of my son and daughter. Chloe wept, leaning dramatically against Trent's shoulder. Trent patted her arm with robotic precision, playing the role of the supportive husband. Now that I am finally stable, now that Trent has given me a safe, loving home, all I want is to be a mother again. I just want my family back. I want to make up for lost time. Cynthia could not resist joining the performance. She leaned forward, pointing a finger directly at me. The venom in her voice was startling, even after everything she had already put me through. Maya has always been jealous, Cynthia spat, ensuring her words were clearly logged into the official transcript. Even when they were little girls, Maya was envious of Chloe's beauty and her spirit. Maya could never hold down a relationship. She is a barren, bitter woman. When Chloe bravely stepped away to handle her mental health, Maya saw an opportunity to steal the life she could never build for herself. She took those children and brainwashed them. She turned my beautiful grandchildren into weapons to punish her sister. I stared at the woman who gave birth to me. The sheer scale of her delusion was breathtaking. She was actively perjuring herself on a federal legal record to assist a billionaire in stealing her grandson's inheritance. She did not know about the $300 million trust. She was simply blinded by Trent's wealth and her lifelong obsession with elevating the golden child. She truly believed she was securing a life of luxury for Chloe, utterly unaware that Chloe was nothing but a pawn in Trent's massive financial heist. Sterling, the lead attorney, cleared his throat, effectively cutting off Cynthia's tirade. He turned his predatory gaze toward me. The fact remains, Mr. Williams, that you hold no legal biological standing. My clients are prepared to offer a highly generous settlement to avoid the trauma of a prolonged court battle. He slid a thick bound document across the mahogany table. If you agree to transfer 80% equity of your branding agency to Mr. Thornton's holding company, my clients will immediately drop the federal kidnapping allegations. Furthermore, they will allow you supervised visitation rights with the minors 1 weekend a month. I looked down at the contract resting on the polished wood. Supervised visitation, 1 weekend a month. They were generously offering to let me see the children. I raised the children who called me mother 12 days a year in exchange for my entire business empire. I looked up, meeting Trent's eyes. I did not speak to the lawyer. I spoke directly to the billionaire orchestrating the siege. Why Trent? I asked, my voice soft, almost vulnerable. I needed him to believe I was breaking. Why are you doing this? You have never met Malik or Aliyah. You are a titan of industry. Why are you spending hundreds of thousands of dollars in legal fees to take in two teenagers who openly despise you? What is your actual motivation here? Trent smiled, a cold, calculating smirk. He believed he had won. He believed I was desperately searching for logic in my defeat. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, ensuring his voice carried clearly to the stenographer. Because Maya, I am a man who values legacy, Trent stated smoothly. I married Chloe because I love her, And when you love a woman, you embrace her entire past. But more importantly, I am a businessman. I look at Malik and Aaliyah and I see untapped potential. They have been raised in a chaotic suburban environment without proper guidance or discipline. He paused, adjusting his expensive silk tie. As their legal and financial guardian, I intend to secure their futures. I intend to manage their educational paths and, more importantly, oversee any future financial estates or trusts they may eventually acquire. I am stepping in to provide the high-level financial stewardship that a struggling agency owner simply cannot provide. I am doing this to protect their financial legacy. I kept my face perfectly still, fighting the urge to smile. I could feel Calvin tense slightly beside me, recognizing the magnitude of what Trent had just admitted on the record. Trent had just explicitly stated his intent to manage and control the children's financial estates. He had officially documented his financial motivation under oath. I turned my attention back to Chloe. I needed to lock down the final piece of the trap. "Chloe," I said, my voice trembling slightly, playing the part of the desperate sister. "If you take them from me, you are ripping them away from the only father figure they have ever known." Malik still keeps the few things his biological father left behind. He asks about him. "Do you even know who he was? Do you even remember the name of the man who gave you these children before you threw them away?" Chloe rolled her eyes, letting out a harsh, dismissive laugh. She waved her hand as if swatting away an annoying insect. "Oh, please, Maya, stop being so dramatic," Chloe scoffed, her voice dripping with contempt. "I was young and stupid. He was a random mistake. A nobody. I do not remember his name, and I certainly do not care. He means absolutely nothing to me or my children. Trent is their father now. Trent is the only father they will ever need." "Are you absolutely certain?" Chloe. Calvin interjected, his voice sharp and precise, ensuring the stenographer captured the exchange perfectly. "You are stating for the record under oath that you have no knowledge of the biological father's identity or his family background." Chloe glared at Calvin. "I am stating for the record that he was a random, meaningless fling. I had no idea who he was then, and I do not know who he is now. Now, are you going to sign the agency transfer, or do we need to proceed to court and take everything you own?" I looked down at the contract on the table. They had done it. They had built a towering house of lies on a legally binding transcript. Trent had admitted his goal was financial control of their estates. Chloe had vehemently denied any knowledge of the Thornton bloodline, committing direct, undeniable perjury. Cynthia had documented her complicity in the fraudulent narrative. I reached out and placed my hand flat on top of the contract. I took a deep breath, letting the false vulnerability fall away. I squared my shoulders and looked Trent directly in the eye. "I will not be signing this document today, Trent," I said, my voice completely steady, ringing with absolute authority. "In fact, I will never be signing this document." Trent's smirk vanished. Sterling, the lawyer, sat up straight, frowning deeply. Cynthia gasped, clutching her handbag. "What are you doing?" Calvin. Sterling demanded, his tone aggressive. "Your client is acting entirely against her own legal interests. If she refuses this settlement, we will proceed to court on Friday, and we will completely destroy her." Calvin closed his leather portfolio with a soft, definitive snap. He stood up, buttoning his suit jacket. "My client is fully aware of her legal interests," Counselor Calvin replied smoothly. "We appreciate you taking the time to outline your terms on the record today." I stood up, grabbing my tote bag from the floor, ensuring the heavy manila envelope remained securely inside. I looked down at Chloe, whose face was rapidly shifting from arrogance to confusion. "I will see you in court on Friday." "Chloe," I said, my voice echoing in the silent boardroom. "And Trent," I turned to the billionaire, whose eyes were now narrowed in dangerous calculation. "Bring your best lawyers. You are going to need every single one of them." Trent let out a harsh, humorless laugh. "You are walking into a slaughterhouse, Maya. You have no money, no leverage, and no biological rights. You are going to lose those kids, and I am going to break you." I offered him a small, chilling smile. "We will see who breaks Trent." Calvin and I walked out of the boardroom, leaving the unsigned contract resting on the mahogany table. The heavy frosted glass doors closed behind us, sealing their fate. The trap was set, the perjury was secured, and the countdown to Friday morning had officially begun. Friday morning arrived with a torrential downpour washing over the Atlanta streets. The heavy rain felt entirely appropriate for the monumental battle ahead. I parked my car in the secure underground garage of the Fulton County Family Court building. Malik and Aaliyah stepped out of the back seat looking much older than their teenage years. Malik wore a sharp navy suit, his broad shoulders stiff with protective tension. Aaliyah wore a modest black dress, her hands trembling as she clutched a small leather purse. I pulled them both into a fierce embrace, right there on the cold concrete. I looked into their eyes and made a solemn vow. I promised them that no matter what lies were spoken in the courtroom upstairs, we were walking out of this building exactly the way we walked in together. We rode the crowded elevator to the fourth floor in complete silence. Calvin was already waiting for us outside the heavy oak double doors of Judge Sterling's courtroom. My attorney looked impeccable, projecting an aura of absolute unshakable calm. He carried a single sleek briefcase. Tucked securely inside was the heavy manila envelope containing the genetic records, the 15-year-old safety deposit box contents, and the certified transcripts from our explosive deposition. Calvin offered a single reassuring nod. The trap was fully loaded. We just needed to let them step onto the trigger. We pushed through the heavy wooden doors and walked down the center aisle. Trent's legal team had practically colonized the entire right side of the room. Trent sat at the center of the polished plaintiff's table, wearing a custom charcoal suit, projecting the arrogant confidence of a billionaire who believed he had already purchased the judicial system. Chloe sat closely beside him, dressed in a demure, high-necked beige dress, a calculated wardrobe choice designed to make her look like a traditional wholesome mother, rather than a woman who had abandoned her toddlers for a luxury vacation. Cynthia sat in the front row of the gallery directly behind them, holding her designer handbag on her lap and refusing to look in my direction. Judge Sterling entered the courtroom, his black robe billowing slightly behind him. He was a stern, older man with a reputation for strict adherence to traditional family structures. He took his seat at the elevated bench, adjusted his reading glasses, and slammed his heavy wooden gavel to call the room to order. The air in the courtroom instantly grew heavy. The final battle for my children's lives had officially begun. Trent's lead attorney, Sterling, stood up and immediately launched into a theatrical opening statement. He painted a devastatingly false picture of the last 14 years. He told the judge that Chloe was a tragic victim of severe postpartum depression who had briefly stepped away to seek medical help. He claimed that I, a jealous and vindictive younger sister, had capitalized on her vulnerable state. He told the court that I changed my phone number, relocated across the city, and deliberately concealed the children from their desperate searching mother. He pointed a dramatic finger at me, calling me a master manipulator who had actively poisoned the minds of two innocent teenagers, turning them against their biological family. Calvin did not object. He sat perfectly still, allowing the opposition to build their towering house of cards. I kept my face entirely blank, staring straight ahead. I could feel Malik shifting angrily in the gallery bench directly behind me, but I reached my hand back and squeezed his knee, urging him to stay calm. The opposition called Chloe to the witness stand first. She walked up the wooden steps, taking the oath with a trembling hand. Once seated, she unleashed a performance that was nothing short of a masterclass in psychological manipulation. She produced a pressed white handkerchief and began dabbing at her completely dry eyes. She wept openly for the court stenographer, recounting a highly fictionalized version of the rainy Tuesday she left the kids on my porch. She claimed she begged me to watch them for just a few days so she could check into a mental health facility. She sobbed about how she returned to an empty apartment, claiming I had vanished into the night with her babies. Judge Sterling leaned forward, his expression softening with visible sympathy. Chloe continued her perjury without a single ounce of hesitation. She testified that she had spent thousands of dollars on private investigators trying to track us down over the past decade. She claimed that she cried herself to sleep every single night, mourning the milestones she missed. She looked directly at Malik and Aliyah in the gallery, her voice cracking perfectly as she told them how much she loved them and how Trent was finally giving her the safe, stable environment she needed to be a proper mother. It was nauseating. It was a complete fabrication, but she delivered it with such raw conviction that anyone lacking the actual facts would have believed every single word. Calvin declined to cross-examine her. He simply stood up, stated, "We had no questions for this witness at this time," and sat back down. Trent smirked visibly from the plaintiff's table, believing Calvin's silence was a sign of total surrender. He thought my frozen bank accounts had rendered my legal defense completely impotent. Next, Trent's lawyers called my own mother to the stand. Cynthia walked to the witness box holding her head high. Watching the woman who gave birth to me swear an oath to tell the truth knowing she was about to destroy me was a profoundly isolating experience. The lawyer asked Cynthia to describe my relationship with Chloe growing up. Cynthia looked at the judge and delivered the ultimate betrayal. She testified that I had always harbored a deeply unnatural jealousy toward my older sister. She claimed I resented Chloe's beauty, her popularity, and her spirit. Cynthia told the court, under penalty of perjury, that I had actively blocked her own attempts to visit her grandchildren over the years. She painted me as an aggressive, unstable woman who hoarded the children like possessions simply to punish the rest of the family. "Maya has always been vindictive," Cynthia stated, her voice ringing clearly across the silent courtroom. "She could never secure a husband of her own. She was barren and lonely. When Chloe bravely took a step back to heal her mental health, Maya saw a twisted opportunity to play house. She stole my daughter's life because she could never build one for herself. These children need to be returned to their real mother and their new father who can actually provide for them." I did not shed a tear. The sheer cruelty of her words severed the final invisible thread tying me to my biological family. I felt a cold, absolute release. Cynthia was no longer my mother. She was simply a hostile witness participating in a massive financial extortion scheme. Trent's attorney concluded their case with a ruthless, aggressive closing argument. He stepped out from behind his table and paced in front of the judge's bench. He listed my frozen business accounts and my supposed violent outburst at the high school as undeniable proof that I was financially and emotionally unfit to retain guardianship. He portrayed Trent as a billionaire savior stepping in to rescue two brainwashed teenagers from a collapsing suburban household. The lawyer did not stop at demanding immediate full custody. He went for the absolute kill shot. He officially petitioned Judge Sterling to strip me of all guardianship rights permanently and irrevocably. He requested that law enforcement escort Malik and Aliyah directly from the courtroom into Trent's custody today. Furthermore, he demanded that my branding agency be entirely liquidated to pay a $5 million judgment in civil damages for the severe emotional distress and alienation of affection I had allegedly caused his clients over the last 14 years. The courtroom felt incredibly heavy. The air was thick with the sheer audacity of their demands. Trent leaned back in his chair, crossing his legs, looking at me with a triumphant, predatory smile. He had executed his corporate raid flawlessly. He had used my own mother to destroy my character. He had used the media to destroy my reputation. He believed he had successfully cornered the $300 million Thornton Trust by securing the biological heir, and he was about to walk out of this courthouse significantly richer. Judge Sterling looked down at his notes, his expression grave and stern. He adjusted his glasses and looked over at our defense table. The judge addressed Calvin, stating that the plaintiffs had presented a highly disturbing pattern of alienation and psychological manipulation. He warned us that the burden of proof now rested entirely on our shoulders to justify why these minors should not be immediately returned to their biological mother and her new husband. Calvin stood up slowly, buttoning his suit jacket. He did not look panicked. He did not look intimidated. He looked like a predator who had patiently waited for the prey to walk completely into the cage and lock the door from the inside. "Your Honor." Calvin began, his voice calm, resonant, and carrying a lethal undertone. "We completely agree that this court has been presented with a disturbing pattern of psychological manipulation, fraud, and extreme financial extortion. However, the perpetrators of this massive criminal conspiracy are not sitting at the defense table. They are sitting directly across from me. Calvin turned and looked dead into Trent's eyes. The billionaire's smirk faltered for a fraction of a second. "We do not intend to call character witnesses, Your Honor," Calvin continued. "We do not need to present emotional testimony to refute the fictional story the plaintiffs just authored under oath. We only require the court to review a single piece of evidence. This evidence will not only immediately terminate this custody petition, but it will require Your Honor to notify the federal authorities of a massive ongoing inheritance fraud." I stood up from my chair, reaching into Calvin's leather briefcase. I pulled out the thick sealed manila envelope. The courtroom was dead silent. Trent sat up straight, his posture suddenly rigid. Chloe looked confused, darting nervous glances between her husband and her lawyer. Cynthia gripped the wooden railing of the gallery, her face paling as she realized the script was deviating from their carefully rehearsed plan. I walked slowly around the defense table, my heels clicking against the hardwood floor, approaching the judge's bench, to deliver the absolute ruin of Trent Thornton. I handed the heavy manila envelope directly to Judge Sterling. He looked down at the thick package resting on his elevated wooden bench and then looked back at me with a deep frown. He adjusted his glasses, clearly annoyed by the breach of standard courtroom protocol. Trent's lead attorney Sterling immediately jumped to his feet, shouting an aggressive objection. He demanded that the envelope be stricken from the record, claiming it was a desperate ambush tactic by a financially ruined woman. Calvin stood up calmly and pulled an identical thick binder from his leather briefcase. He walked over to the plaintiff's table and dropped the duplicate evidence right in front of Trent's highly paid legal team. Calvin formally requested that the judge review the documents before ruling on the objection, stating that the contents contained direct evidence of ongoing federal inheritance fraud, perjury, and criminal extortion taking place inside this very courtroom. The word fraud echoed loudly off the high ceilings. Judge Sterling raised an eyebrow, silencing the opposing counsel with a sharp gesture of his hand. He picked up his silver letter opener and sliced through the top of the manila envelope. The entire courtroom held its collective breath. I stood perfectly still at the center of the room, my eyes locked on the judge. Behind me, I could hear the faint rustling of Malik and Aliyah shifting in the wooden gallery pews. Judge Sterling pulled out the first stack of papers. They were the certified birth certificates, the genealogical DNA records, and the highly confidential Thornton family trust documents Silas had unearthed from the safety deposit box. The judge began to read. I watched his eyes track back and forth across the dense legal text. I watched his brow furrow in deep confusion. Then I watched the exact second his brain connected the impossible puzzle pieces. His eyes widened significantly behind his thick lenses. He looked up from the paper, staring directly at Trent, who was sitting confidently at the plaintiff's table. Judge Sterling looked back down at the paper, flipping rapidly to the highlighted section of the $300 million trust declaration. He read the clause mandating that the entire corporate empire bypass the younger son and vested immediately to the firstborn grandson upon his 18th birthday. The judge looked up again, this time his eyes bypassing Trent and landing squarely on Malik sitting in the gallery. The color rapidly drained from Judge Sterling's face, leaving his skin a pale ashen gray. Trent's lead attorney was frantically flipping through the duplicate binder Calvin had dropped on their table. The lawyer was a seasoned corporate shark, but as he read the genealogical records and the trust documents, his arrogant posture completely collapsed. He physically pushed his rolling chair a few inches away from Trent. The lawyer realized instantly that his billionaire client had not hired him to win a standard custody battle. Trent had hired him to unknowingly facilitate a massive federal crime. Judge Sterling swallowed hard, visibly shaken by the magnitude of the wealth and the deception sitting on his desk. He reached into the envelope and pulled out the second piece of evidence. It was the faded, worn contract I had found in the safety deposit box, the one bearing Chloe's distinctive signature. The judge read the document, and his face hardened into a mask of absolute fury. He looked directly at Chloe, who was still dabbing her dry eyes with her white linen handkerchief. Judge Sterling read the contract aloud, his voice vibrating with barely contained judicial rage. He stated for the official court record that the document was a notarized agreement dated 14 years ago. He read the exact clause where Chloe explicitly, permanently, and irreversibly surrendered all biological and legal rights to her two children in direct exchange for a cash payment of $20,000 provided by the children's biological father. A loud collective gasp swept through the courtroom. Cynthia, who was sitting in the front row, dropped her expensive designer handbag straight onto the floor. The heavy clasp hit the hardwood with a loud crack. Cynthia stared at her golden child, her mouth hanging wide open in sheer horror. Chloe had not just abandoned her children to find herself. She had not left them on my porch because she was suffering from postpartum depression. She had literally sold them for cash to fund her partying lifestyle. Chloe froze, her face turning a sickly shade of white. She looked frantically at Trent, seeking his protection, but Trent was not looking at her. Trent was staring at me with a look of pure, unfiltered panic. The billionaire realized the trap had snapped shut. His corporate raid was dead. Judge Sterling did not stop there. He reached into the envelope one last time and pulled out the certified transcripts from our boardroom deposition. He read the highlighted portions where Trent, arrogant and overly confident, explicitly admitted under oath that his sole motivation for adopting the teenagers was to gain legal control over their future financial estates. The judge then read Chloe's sworn testimony, where she vehemently denied having any knowledge of the biological father's identity or his family background. The judge slammed the papers down onto his desk. The sound echoed like a gunshot. He looked at Trent and Chloe with a level of disgust I had never seen a legal professional display. They had marched into his courtroom, presented themselves as wealthy, righteous saviors, and brazenly lied to his face. They had committed perjury on the stand, trying to use his judicial authority to execute a $300 million heist against two innocent teenagers. Judge Sterling slowly took off his glasses. He looked over the bench, staring at Malik and Aliyah sitting in the gallery. He looked at the two teenagers who had grown up in my modest suburban home, wearing secondhand clothes and sharing a single bathroom, completely unaware that they were the sole heirs to one of the largest corporate empires in the state. The judge looked back down at me, standing tall and unwavering before his bench. The silence in the room was absolute, ringing in my ears. "Do they know?" Judge Sterling asked, his voice barely a whisper, carrying the profound weight of the revelation. I stood perfectly straight, squaring my shoulders. I looked at the judge, then turned my head slightly to look at my sister and the billionaire who tried to destroy my life. "Not yet," I replied, my voice carrying clearly and forcefully across the silent courtroom, ensuring every single person heard me. I wanted to protect them from the greed. I wanted them to grow up knowing the value of hard work, of loyalty, and of a family that actually shows up when things get hard. But today, they get their legacy. And she? I pointed a single steady finger directly at Chloe, gets absolutely nothing. The courtroom completely exploded. The polite decorum vanished in an instant, replaced by sheer unadulterated chaos. Chloe shrieked, jumping up from her chair and grabbing Trent's arm, demanding he do something, demanding he call the police on me for forging the documents. But Trent violently shoved her hands away, his pristine billionaire facade completely shattered. He realized in that exact moment that Chloe was totally useless to him now. The secret was out. The trust was exposed. He could not gain financial guardianship over an 18-year-old who was now legally an adult and fully aware of his inheritance. "You idiot!" Trent roared at Chloe, his face purple with rage, completely ignoring the judge and the bailiffs. "You told me the aunt had nothing. You told me she was a broke loser we could crush in a week. You sold me out to a woman who just handed me over to the federal authorities." Chloe stared at her wealthy husband, her eyes wide with terror as she realized the horrifying truth. Trent did not love her. He had never loved her. He only married her because she possessed the biological key to the Thornton empire. He had used her just as ruthlessly as she had tried to use me. She was nothing to him but a pawn, and now the game was entirely over. Trent's lead attorney grabbed his briefcase, snapping it shut with incredible speed. He did not say a word to his client. He simply turned his back on Trent Thornton and power-walked straight down the center aisle of the courtroom, fleeing the scene of the crime to protect his own legal license. Judge Sterling grabbed his heavy wooden gavel and slammed it against the sounding block, repeatedly demanding order in the court. The sharp cracks echoed over the shouting, but the chaos took several minutes to subside. Court security officers moved quickly down the aisles, positioning themselves strategically around the plaintiff's table, ready to intervene if Trent became physically violent. When the room finally quieted down, Judge Sterling leaned over the bench, his eyes burning with judicial fury. He addressed Trent and Chloe, their legal team having completely abandoned them. In my 30 years on the bench, I have never witnessed a more vile, calculated, and malicious abuse of the family court system, Judge Sterling declared, his voice shaking with anger. You came into this courtroom and attempted to use the law to facilitate a massive financial crime against two innocent minors. You committed perjury, you engaged in extortion, you attempted to destroy the livelihood of a woman who stepped up to raise the children you discarded. The judge picked up his pen and began signing the documents on his desk with aggressive, forceful strokes. I am hereby throwing out the kidnapping allegations and the civil suit for alienation of affection with extreme prejudice, Judge Sterling announced, ensuring the court stenographer captured every word. I am granting Maya full, permanent, and irrevocable legal custody of the minor child Aaliyah. Furthermore, I am ordering the immediate lifting of the asset freeze on Maya's personal and business accounts. I let out a shaky breath, closing my eyes for just a second as the immense weight lifted off my chest. My agency was safe. My employees would get paid. My home belonged to us again. But the judge was not finished. As for you, Mr. Thornton and Mrs. Thornton, Judge Sterling continued, glaring at them, I am formally referring this entire case file, including the forged testimonies and the trust documents, directly to the United States Attorney's Office. You are both facing active federal investigations for attempted inheritance fraud, perjury, and criminal extortion. You are not to leave the state of Georgia. The gavel slammed down one final time, sealing their absolute ruin. The sound rang through the courtroom like a victory bell. Calvin placed a firm, reassuring hand on my shoulder, a rare smile breaking across his professional face. We did it, Maya, he said quietly. You saved them. I turned away from the bench and walked toward the gallery. Malik and Aaliyah were standing up, their faces a mixture of shock, awe, and profound relief. Malik pulled me into a massive, crushing hug, burying his face in my shoulder. Aaliyah wrapped her arms around my waist, crying tears of pure joy. I held them tightly, breathing in the scent of their hair, knowing the nightmare was finally over. We had faced down a billionaire giant and a toxic ghost from the past, and we had burned their entire world to the ash it deserved to be. The silence in the courtroom following my declaration was absolute, but it only lasted for a fraction of a second. Then the entire room completely exploded into sheer, unadulterated chaos. The weight of the $300 million revelation crashed down on Trent and Chloe with the force of a collapsing building. Trent lunged out of his heavy wooden chair, his face contorted into a mask of pure panic and unfiltered rage. He did not look at the judge. He did not look at my lawyer. He turned his vicious, predatory glare directly onto the woman he had just sworn to love and protect. You absolute fool! Trent roared at Chloe, his voice echoing off the high vaulted ceilings of the courtroom. He pointed a shaking finger at her face, his pristine billionaire facade entirely shattered. You told me the aunt had nothing. You told me she was a broke nobody we could crush in a week. You sold me out to a woman who just handed me over to the federal authorities on a silver platter. Chloe shrank back against the heavy wooden defense table, her hands flying to her mouth in absolute terror. The color completely drained from her heavily contoured face, leaving her looking pale and suddenly very old. She stared up at her wealthy white husband, and the horrifying truth finally dawned in her eyes. Trent did not love her. He had never loved her for a single second. He only married her because she possessed the biological key to the Thornton empire. He had used her just as ruthlessly as she had tried to use me. She was nothing to him but a pawn in a massive corporate heist, and now the game was entirely over. Trent's highly paid corporate lawyer did not say a single word to his client. He realized instantly that Trent had knowingly involved their prestigious law firm in a massive federal crime. The lawyer grabbed his expensive leather briefcase, snapped the golden clasps shut with incredible speed and power, walked straight down the center aisle of the courtroom, fleeing the scene to protect his own legal license. He left Trent standing completely alone, abandoned by the very system he thought he could buy. Judge Sterling grabbed his heavy wooden gavel and slammed it against the sounding block, repeatedly demanding order in the court. The sharp cracks echoed over the shouting, but the chaos took several minutes to subside. Court security officers moved quickly down the aisles, positioning themselves strategically around the plaintiff's table, ready to intervene if Trent became physically violent. When the room finally quieted down, Judge Sterling leaned over the bench, his eyes burning with intense judicial fury. He addressed Trent and Chloe, who were now standing as far apart from each other as physically possible. In my 30 years on the bench, I have never witnessed a more vile, calculated, and malicious abuse of the family court system, Judge Sterling declared, his voice shaking with anger. You came into this courtroom and attempted to use the law to facilitate a massive financial crime against two innocent minors. You committed perjury. You engaged in extortion. You attempted to destroy the livelihood of a woman who stepped up to raise the children you callously discarded for $20,000. The judge picked up his heavy fountain pen and began signing the legal documents on his desk with aggressive, forceful strokes. I am hereby throwing out the kidnapping allegations and the civil suit for alienation of affection with extreme prejudice, Judge Sterling announced, ensuring the court stenographer captured every single word for the official record. I am granting Maya full permanent and irrevocable legal custody of the minor children Malik and Aliyah. Furthermore, I am ordering the immediate lifting of the asset freeze on Maya's personal and business accounts. I let out a shaky breath, closing my eyes for just a second as the immense weight lifted off my chest. My branding agency was safe. My employees would get paid on Friday. My home belonged to us again. But the judge was not finished dropping the hammer. As for you, Mr. Thornton and Mrs. Thornton, Judge Sterling continued, glaring down at them with absolute disgust. I am formally referring this entire case file, including the forged testimonies, the signed relinquishment contract, and the trust documents, directly to the United States Attorney's Office. You are both facing active federal investigations for attempted inheritance fraud, perjury, and criminal extortion. You are required to surrender your passports immediately, and you are not to leave the state of Georgia under any circumstances. The gavel slammed down one final time, sealing their absolute ruin. The sound rang through the courtroom like a victory bell. Calvin placed a firm, reassuring hand on my shoulder, a rare, genuine smile breaking across his professional face. We did it, Maya, he said quietly. You saved them. You saved everything. I turned away from the judge's bench and walked back toward the gallery. Malik and Aliyah were standing up, their faces a mixture of shock, awe, and profound relief. Malik pulled me into a massive, crushing hug, burying his face in my shoulder. Aliyah wrapped her arms tightly around my waist, crying tears of pure joy and release. I held them tightly, breathing in the scent of their hair, knowing the 14-year nightmare was finally over. We had faced down a billionaire giant and a toxic ghost from the past, and we had burned their entire world to the ash it deserved to be. We walked out of the courtroom together, keeping our heads held high, presenting a united, unbroken front. But the battle was not entirely finished. As we pushed through the heavy wooden double doors into the bright marble hallway, we found my mother Cynthia waiting for us. Cynthia looked completely destroyed. Her designer handbag was clutched tightly against her chest, and her face was stained with running mascara. The reality of Chloe's actions had finally pierced through her decades of delusion. She realized her golden child had not only abandoned her grandchildren, but had literally sold them for cash to fund a partying lifestyle. She realized she had actively aided a billionaire in trying to steal her own grandson's inheritance, while actively trying to destroy the daughter who had actually held the family together. Maya. Cynthia cried out, her voice cracking as she rushed toward us. Maya, please wait. You have to listen to me. I had no idea. I swear to you, I had no idea about the money or the contract. I thought she just needed help. I always knew you were a good mother, Maya. I always knew it deep down. I stopped walking. I did not yell. I did not scream or cause a scene in the courthouse hallway. I looked at the woman who gave birth to me, the woman who had stood on my front porch and called me a jealous barren spinster. I looked at her with absolute icy detachment. "You do not get to do this, Cynthia," I said, my voice dropping to a low lethal register that made her physically flinch. "You do not get to play the victim now that your golden child has been exposed as a fraud and a criminal. You stood in that courtroom and committed perjury to help a stranger destroy my life. You looked at my children and told them they belonged with a woman who sold them for $20,000. Cynthia reached out a trembling hand trying to touch my arm. "Please, Maya," she begged, tears streaming down her face. "You are my daughter. They are my grandchildren. We can fix this. We can be a family again." I stepped back, ensuring she could not touch me. "You lost your daughter and your grandchildren the exact moment you chose a price tag and a luxury lifestyle over loyalty and truth," I stated firmly. "Do not ever contact me again. Do not ever approach my children again. If you show up at my house or my agency, I will have you arrested for trespassing. You are nothing to us now." I did not wait for her response. I turned my back on my mother and walked down the marble hallway with Malik and Aliyah by my side, leaving Cynthia standing completely alone, weeping into her hands. The toxic cycle was permanently broken. I had finally severed the infected roots of my family tree, allowing us to grow and thrive without their poison. Fast forward 6 months, and our reality looks entirely different from the desperate struggle we faced in that courtroom. Trent Thornton is currently sitting in a federal holding facility awaiting trial for massive corporate fraud, extortion, and attempted inheritance theft. His legal team abandoned him, his corporate board ousted him, and his billionaire assets have been largely seized by federal investigators. Chloe is entirely broke. Trent divorced her the moment the trust scheme failed, leaving her with absolutely nothing but mounting legal debt and pending perjury charges. She is facing significant prison time and has no wealthy husband to bail her out. Cynthia lives completely cut off from our lives, isolated in her own regret, having lost the only family she had left. Meanwhile, I am standing on the sprawling marble balcony of a beautiful new estate, located in the most exclusive neighborhood in Atlanta. The sunset is painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and purple. Malik and Aliyah are sitting at a patio table, laughing and reviewing college brochures. The transition was not easy, but we navigated the reality of the $300 million Thornton Trust as a family. Malik officially inherited his legacy, but he immediately placed the majority of the funds into a secure managed portfolio, naming me as the primary advisory trustee until he graduates college. My branding agency did not just survive the corporate sabotage, it flourished. The intense public spotlight from the high-profile legal battle actually brought in a massive wave of new elite clients who respected a CEO willing to fight fiercely for her own. I expanded the business, moving into a larger office space, and doubling my staff, ensuring the people who stood by me during the darkest hours were rewarded for their loyalty. I look at my nephew and my niece, safe, secure, and stepping into a future that absolutely no one can ever steal from them again. I did not just survive my family's horrific betrayal. I became the architect of their absolute ruin and the fierce, unstoppable protector of our new empire. The battle was won, and the war was finally over. We were untouchable. But being untouchable does not mean the dust settles overnight. The fallout from that day in Judge Sterling's courtroom rippled through the city of Atlanta like a massive seismic shockwave. Trent Thornton truly believed his vast wealth made him a god among men. He learned very quickly that the federal government does not bow to false idols. The United States Attorney's Office did not waste a single second. Less than 48 hours after Judge Sterling handed over our evidence, federal agents marched straight into the grand lobby of Trent's glass-walled corporate fortress. The very same security guards who had tried to intimidate me watched in stunned silence as the FBI seized servers, boxed up hard drives, and locked down the entire executive floor. The sheer poetic justice of it all was beautiful. Trent had used a corrupt judge to freeze my modest business accounts and suffocate my livelihood. Now the federal government had stepped in and completely frozen his multi-billion-dollar empire. Trent attempted to fight the criminal charges with all the aggressive arrogance of a man who had never been told no in his entire life. He tried to hire the most ruthless defense attorneys in the country, but the evidence we provided was entirely bulletproof. The trial was an absolute media spectacle. Trent had to sit in the federal courthouse and listen as prosecutors read his own words back to him. The certified audio recordings from our boardroom meeting, where he coldly calculated the hostile takeover of my life, echoed clearly through the courtroom speakers. When the verdict finally came down, Trent was stripped of his bespoke suits and his smug superiority. The federal judge dismantled his holding companies to pay massive regulatory fines and sentenced him to 15 years in a maximum security facility for conspiracy wire fraud and attempted extortion. The billionaire who tried to steal my teenager's legacy was reduced to a standard federal inmate number. Chloe fared no better in the aftermath. The moment the federal investigation began, Trent's defense strategy involved throwing his wife directly under the bus. He claimed she was the evil mastermind who had manipulated him into the custody battle. There is absolutely no loyalty among thieves. Trent immediately filed for a ruthless divorce, cutting her off from all his financial assets to protect himself. Chloe found herself facing multiple counts of severe perjury and fraud without a single dime to her name. The woman who had strutted into the steakhouse dripping in diamonds and designer labels had to rely on an overworked public defender. During her sentencing hearing, she tried to play the tragic victim card one last time. She turned around in her chair and looked directly at Malik and Aliyah, who were sitting in the gallery safely beside me. She cried real terrified tears, begging them to speak to the judge on her behalf. She pleaded with them to show mercy to their biological mother. Malik did not even blink. He looked at the woman who gave birth to him, the woman who sold him for $20,000, and simply turned his head away, refusing to acknowledge her existence. That silent, absolute rejection broke whatever manipulative spirit she had left. She pleaded guilty to avoid serving hard time and was sentenced to 5 years of strict probation. She had to pawn her tennis bracelets and her luxury handbags just to afford the security deposit on a rundown one-bedroom apartment on the outskirts of the city. She had chased wealth her entire life, sacrificing her own flesh and blood to get it. In the end, her greed left her with absolutely nothing. And then there was Cynthia, my mother, the woman who had stood in a court of law and perjured herself to destroy the daughter who had actually stepped up to do her job. The public humiliation she suffered was absolute. The court transcripts became a matter of public record, and Atlanta is a city where social reputation is everything. Cynthia's elite circle of friends read exactly what she had done. They read how she had supported a billionaire trying to steal her grandson's inheritance while viciously gaslighting the daughter who had saved her family. Cynthia was swiftly expelled from her country club. The women she had spent years trying to impress wanted absolutely nothing to do with a grandmother who helped orchestrate a criminal conspiracy. She was forced to sell her sprawling house to cover the astronomical legal fees she incurred trying to defend herself during the federal investigation. She became a complete pariah. She tried to reach out to me for months. My security cameras would capture her pulling up to the heavy iron gates of our new estate, sitting in her car and crying. She mailed handwritten letters pouring out her apologies, claiming she was blinded by Trent's influence and that she always knew I was the strong one. I never read them. I handed every single envelope directly to my lawyer to add to the restraining order file. She had chosen a price tag over her own blood. She had to live with the suffocating silence of that choice. While their toxic world burned to the ground, our world expanded into something truly magnificent. The transition into managing the Thornton family trust was not easy, but we navigated it with the same fierce loyalty that had kept us alive for 14 years. Malik legally inherited his rightful legacy the day he turned 18, but he did not let the massive influx of money change his character. He is a Thornton by blood, but he is my son by design. He immediately placed the majority of the $300 million trust into a secure managed portfolio and appointed me as the primary advisory trustee until he finishes his college education. He is currently attending a top-tier university studying business administration, preparing to eventually take the reins of his empire properly. He calls me every single Sunday evening to tell me about his classes and ask for my advice on his introductory finance courses. Aaliyah is thriving in her senior year of high school. The panic and anxiety that Chloe brought into our lives has completely vanished. She is the captain of her debate team, fiercely intelligent, and carrying herself with the unshakable confidence of a young woman who knows exactly what she is worth. She already has her sights set on law school, entirely inspired by Calvin's brilliant performance in the courtroom. As for my branding agency, the attempt to destroy my professional reputation backfired spectacularly. When the truth about the extortion and the kidnapping hoax went public, the Atlanta business community rallied behind me in full force. The corporate clients who had paused their contracts returned immediately, bringing massive new accounts with them. They wanted to work with a CEO who was completely fearless, a woman who had stared down a billionaire corporate raider and absolutely destroyed him. I had to double my office space and hire 20 new employees just to keep up with the demand. I even established a mentorship program within my agency specifically designed to help young single mothers build their own businesses. I wanted to ensure that no woman ever felt as helpless and cornered as I did 14 years ago. It is a quiet Friday evening, and I am standing on the sprawling marble balcony of our new estate. The house sits on 10 acres of pristine wooded land, offering absolute privacy and security. The sunset is painting the Georgia sky in brilliant shades of burnt orange and deep violet. The air is warm and sweet, smelling of pine and blooming jasmine. I hold a glass of sparkling cider, watching Malik and Aaliyah sitting at the patio table below. They are laughing loudly, arguing playfully over whose turn it is to choose the movie for our family night. I look at them and my heart swells with a pride so profound it physically aches. 14 years ago, I was a terrified 21-year-old sitting on a mattress on the floor, holding two crying babies, and wondering how I was going to buy milk. I sacrificed my 20s, my dating life, and my freedom. I built an entire universe out of spare parts and sheer willpower. I fought through poverty, exhaustion, and the ultimate betrayal of my own biological family. They thought I was weak because I loved deeply. They thought my devotion to those kids made me vulnerable to their extortion. They completely underestimated the ferocious, lethal power of a mother defending her own. Trent, Chloe, and Cynthia tried to tear down my sanctuary to line their own pockets. Instead, they handed my children the keys to a generational empire and secured their own total destruction. I take a sip of my cider, the cool liquid grounding me in the present moment. I am Maya, 35 years old, CEO, millionaire advisory trustee, and mother. I did not just survive the fire my family set. I walked through the flames, pulled my children to safety, and used the remaining embers to burn their kingdom to the ground. We are safe. We are prosperous. And looking out over the magnificent life we built together, I know with absolute unwavering certainty that we have finally won.